Chapter 885. Yang Fan gestured to Ren Wei and quickly walked to open the door. The old steward had just arrived at the door. Seeing Yang Fan come out, he hurriedly said, "Ah Lang, something bad has happened. Several soldiers from Thousand Horsemen camp have come. All of them are wounded. They say they were wounded by the Jinwu guards, and many of them were taken away by them." Yang Fan's expression tightened, and he said in a deep voice, "I'll go take a look." Yang Fan started to walk out with Ren Wei following closely behind. Yang Fan swiftly rushed to the front yard and saw several soldiers sitting or standing in the gatehouse, all of them covered in blood. Yang Fan saw from a distance, and his heart sank. There were saber wounds. Recently, the conflict between the Jinwu guards and Thousand Horsemen camp had become increasingly intense. Both sides had fought at times, but fighting was not a battle. Even if both sides had weapons, other than when Yang Fan was punishing Prince Consort Wei and had used weapons because of obstructing official duties, both sides had only fought with their fists and legs or randomly picked up a stick from a roadside shop. No one dared to use weapons because, once weapons were used, the nature of the fight would be different. But today, his soldiers had saber wounds on them. This meant that the conflict between the two sides had escalated, and the other side had people who could no longer restrain themselves and used weapons. Yang Fan quickly walked to the gatehouse. When the wounded soldiers saw Yang Fan, they all stood up. Those with more serious injuries were helped up by others. Yang Fan looked at them and supported a wounded soldier who was standing on one leg. He asked in concern, "Is it serious?" The wounded soldier tried to straighten his body and loudly replying to General, "This lowly officer's fine. My leg was hit by a saber, but the tendons and bones are not injured." Pausing, he continued in a loud voice, "As long as this lowly officer can rest for 10 days or half a month, this lowly officer can take back the face that our Thousand Horsemen camp has lost and flip over those sons of ** cheese." Yang Fan roared with laughter and affectionately punched the soldier's shoulder, saying, "If you wait until you recover before taking back the face, then you'll be losing the face of all the brothers of our Thousand Horsemen camp. You are injured. Can't the brothers and I help you get it back?" Finishing, Yang Fan's expression turned solemn as he asked one of the squad leaders, "What happened?" The squad leader recounted the entire story. Ren Wei, who was standing at the side, couldn't help but frown. The friction between the Thousand Cavalry camp and the Jinwu guards had been very intense recently. The soldiers of both sides were like a flock of enraged roosters. As long as they saw each other, they would think of ways to start a conflict. After a few clashes, it could be said that both sides had their own victories and defeats, and all of them were within a controllable range. Today, this group of soldiers had followed Gao Chu into the city for the wedding banquet. Gao Chu was already engaged, but the people in the camp might not be able to come out on the day of his wedding. In particular, the soldiers might not be qualified to attend the Gao family's wedding banquet. Thus, Gao Chu brought his good brothers from the camp out to set up a few tables. The Yu had a moment, and Wei went to, and the Tian camp, and they and Gao Fan Wei, and he and the Wei, and the two. Gao Chu and the others were shocked and furious. Just as they were about to use their weapons to counterattack, 6 or 7 thieves ran out of a small shop, following which a large group of Jinwu guards appeared and captured the thieves. They then accused the Thousand Cavalry camp of harboring criminals and obstructing law enforcement. Gao Chu and the others were both shocked and furious. Just as they were about to use their weapons to counterattack, 6 or 7 thieves suddenly ran out of a small shop by the roadside, following which a large number of Jinwu guards suddenly appeared and captured these thieves in one fell swoop. They then accused the Thousand Horsemen battalion of harboring criminals and obstructing law enforcement, intending to arrest Gao Chu and the others. Gao Chu immediately knew that he had fallen into the enemy's trap. He quickly led his men to break out of the encirclement, hoping to deliver the news to Yang Fan. Gao Chu knew that he had fallen for the enemy's trap. He quickly led his men to break out of the encirclement, hoping to deliver the news to Yang Fan. The squad leader was 100 cavalrymen and spoke in an orderly manner. As he spoke, Yang Fan's face grew darker and darker. When the squad leader was done, the soldiers looked at Yang Fan, waiting for him to make a decision. After pondering for a moment, Yang Fan instructed Ren Wei, "Send our brothers back to camp and let them recuperate. Tell Commander Liu about the matter and have him negotiate with the Jin Wu guards to get them back." Ren Wei whispered, "General, the King of Hanoi is in charge of the Jin Wu guards. I'm afraid he won't buy Commander Liu's words." Yang Fan nodded lightly. "I know. Just do as I say." Back then, Yang Fan agreed to let Liu Maofeng join the 1,000 cavalry camp because he had his eyes on Liu Maofeng's 2 meat shields. How could he not make use of them now? Ren Wei agreed. Because some of the injured soldiers were more seriously injured and were still bleeding, he went to the mansion to find some medicine to bandage their wounds. Ren Wei then had people go to the streets to hire a few carriages to carry the injured soldiers away. Yang Fan then left for the imperial palace. Wu Zetian successfully changed the crown prince. On the surface, the Wu and Li families were connected by marriage and in harmony. This made Wu Zetian very happy and felt that the future was bright. Wu Zetian had been scheming her entire life. Of course, she understood that when it comes to imperial power and officialdom, benefits were the most fundamental decision. However, she was still optimistic that with her arrangements, the Wu and Li families could live in harmony. Thus, these few days, Wu Zetian was in an exceptionally good mood. When she heard that Yang Fan wanted to see her, she was laughing at a joke told by Zhang Yiji. Unfortunately, Zhang Yiji's joke was about Song Bati. Even though Song Bati had given many gifts, in Zhang Yiji's heart, he was still a lowly person. Zhang Yiji could give him face and glory because of Song Bati's generous gifts. He could also use him as a joke to please Wu Zetian. When Wu Zetian heard that Yang Fan wanted to see her, she said to Zhang Yiji with a smile, "This Yang Fan, Zhen is most afraid that he will want to see her. Nothing good will happen if he comes. Don't let it be one of Zhen's granddaughters hitting the prince consort again." Zhang Yiji teased, "If that's the case, this official thinks that the sage should transfer him to the imperial clan temple and let him handle the imperial family's affairs." When Wu Zetian heard this, she laughed loudly again. Amidst the laughter, Yang Fan walked into the palace hall. Seeing Wu Zetian lying on Zhang Yiji's lap, he quickly lowered his gaze and said respectfully, "Subject Yang Fan greets His Majesty." Wu Zetian said with a smile, "Subject Yang wants to see Zhen. What is the matter?" Yang Fan said, "It's like this. I remember that last time this official told His Majesty that I saw Ian Junju hitting the princess's horse on the street. This official went forward to stop her, but a troop of golden guards just happened to arrive. Because they were acquainted with Ian Junju, they tried to stop this official. As a result, this official came into conflict with them." Wu Zetian asked, "What happened?" Yang Fan said with great grievance, "Who would have thought that after this incident, the 1,000 cavalry camp would come into conflict with the Golden Guards?" After that, Yang Fan recounted the numerous fights between the Golden Guards and the 1,000 horsemen camp, but he didn't mention what had happened today. Sometimes the 1,000 horsemen battalion had the upper hand, and other times the Jinwu guards had the upper hand. However, in Yang Fan's narration, he naturally avoided the important and focused on the trivial, portraying himself as a victim who was willing to compromise. First impressions are very important, especially in the heart of a powerful and stubborn old woman. After Yang Fan finished narrating the events, he said, "The Golden Guards are under the command of King Lin Chuan. This official's position is lowly, so how would I dare to go against King Lin Chuan? However, the Golden Guards have repeatedly pressured me. This official endured and restrained my subordinates many times, but after suppressing me for a long time, my subordinates grew resentful, thinking that this official does not cherish my subordinates. These soldiers are all from the imperial army and have high standards. Now that they have become His Majesty's 1,000 cavalry, they even consider themselves as the Son of Heaven's personal guards. They are usually arrogant and insufferably arrogant. Other than His Majesty, there is probably no one else in their eyes. This official has repeatedly suppressed them, causing them to be dissatisfied. I'm afraid that things will change after a long time, so... When Wu Zetian heard this, her heart relaxed. So it wasn't her granddaughter who had beaten her grandson-in-law again. 2 armies had clashed, and such a small matter had to be resolved right in front of her. Wu Zetian felt quite annoyed. However, when she thought about how the Golden Guards were under Wu Yizong's command, and how he was her nephew, Yang Fan wouldn't be able to voice his grievances if he didn't come looking for her. Wu Zetian said, "Can't you just talk to Yizong about such a small matter? This is all for official business, so why do you have to go this far?" She thought about it for a moment, then said, "We understand Yizong's temperament. If it isn't easy to communicate with him, you can ask Sansi to mediate on your behalf. If I personally interfere with such a small matter, not only will I lose the dignity of an emperor, it will also be disadvantageous to your command." Yang Fan hurriedly said, "Yes, this official will do as your Majesty has instructed." With that he bowed and left the hall. When Wu Zetian heard that the Son of Heaven's personal guards only had eyes for her, she was quite pleased with herself. She then thought about how Yang Fan hadn't sought out King Liang first, but had instead come to complain to her. It seemed like her advice that, as long as I am on the throne, I should be the only one in his eyes had been deeply ingrained in him. However, if she, as the emperor's subordinate, were to step forward to resolve this matter, she would become a laughing-stock in the bureaucracy. How could the glorious Son of Heaven interfere in something like this? If that were the case, the emperor would be far too worthless. What she didn't know was that it was precisely because of these thoughts of hers that the situation had spiraled out of control, and that she really had to step forward to resolve it. When Yang Fan heard Wu Zetian's words, he immediately went to King Liang's estate. King Liang had been secretly delighted when he found out that Zhu and had beaten up the Li clan's son-in-law, and had put even more effort into trying to win him over. When he heard that Zhu had come to seek an audience, he immediately adopted a courteous attitude and personally welcomed him into his study. When Yang Fan told him the reason for his visit, Wu Sansi's brows immediately furrowed. As a leader, it was taboo for his subordinates to group together and be closer to him. If his subordinates were to compete with each other, that would be in line with his interests. However, Yang Fan and Wu Yizong had clearly crossed the line. Even so, it would be difficult for him to step forward. He wasn't the emperor yet, and he urgently needed the support of his subordinates. No matter which side he favored, the other side would inevitably be bitterly disappointed. Putting past matters aside, this time, Yang Fan was the one who beat up the Golden Guards first, and Wu Yizong's status was far higher than Yang Fan's, so it was impossible for him to swallow it down. However, now that Yang Fan's men had been captured by the Golden Guards, Yang Fan wouldn't be able to avoid feeling bitterly disappointed if he just stood by and did nothing. Wu Sansi frowned and thought to himself, "I'll just brush him off for now. Once Yizong has vented his anger, I'll try to persuade him to let him go." Wu Sansi said to Yang Fan, "I understand. You should return and wait for my news. I will hold a banquet and invite Yizong over to have a good chat with him. Do your best not to blow this matter up." Yang Fan cupped his fists and said, "In that case, I will have to trouble your Highness King Liang." Wu Sansi grunted in acknowledgement, then said, "You should restrain your subordinates as well. Also, don't make this matter known to the higher-ups. It won't look good for anyone if things get out of hand." Chapter 886. When Yang Fan returned to the 1,000 horsemen camp, Chu Kuanga, Ma Qiao, Huang Xuchang, Lu Yan, and the other officers immediately surrounded him. Some were quarreling and some were cursing at him. It was impossible to hear what they were saying. Yang Fan's face darkened and he shouted, All of you, shut up! Yang Fan swept his eyes over them and asked, Has Commander Lu returned? Your humble servant is here. Lu Maofeng squeezed in from behind the crowd with a bitter smile on his face. He followed closely behind Su Liang, who also squeezed in with his armor slanted. Yang Fan eased his tone and said to Lu Maofeng, Commander Lu, how did it go? Lu Maofeng said with a face full of shame and anger, Your humble servant was ordered to go to the Jinwu guards. The king of Hanoi did not even let me enter the gate and only sent a message. Yang Fan stared at him and said, Oh, what did he say? Commander Lu said angrily, He said that my status is not enough. I want General Yu. Yang Fan said, Pass on whatever he said, there is no need to worry. Commander Lu said, Yes. He said, Tell Yang Fan to come and kowtow to me from the gate, all the way to the marshal's tent. If I am happy, I will let him go. Yang Fan was furious. He knew that the emperor would not come forward to mediate the conflict between the two groups of soldiers. What did he take the emperor for? He went to the emperor to put on a show because he was afraid that Wu Yizong would use his status as a relative of the emperor to report him to Wu Zetian first. He went to see Wu Sanxi because he really wanted to use a more peaceful method to save the hostage first. There was no reason to hold a hostage there and get angry first. Unexpectedly, Wu Sanxi's attitude was very perfunctory. This made Yang Fan very disappointed. Now that he heard Wu Yizong say this, how could he not be angry? Even if he saw the emperor, unless it was a grand court meeting or an important ceremony such as worshipping heaven and earth ancestors, he didn't need to kneel. Wu Yizong dared to say such words? What was important was not how this sentence humiliated him, but how it expressed Wu Yizong's attitude. Clearly this time he had set up a trap and was prepared to justify his actions. Because Lu Maofeng did not manage to complete the task, he felt a little ashamed. In fact, he was only a subordinate who was ordered to negotiate. If he failed to complete the task, he could be angry at his comrade's misfortune. But the shame was not his business. The one who lost face was him, the commander-in-chief Yang Fan. It was just that because Lu Maofeng's background was different from the others, he was ostracized at first. It was only after he contributed a lot in the last review that his relationship with his colleagues eased up. It was a very uncomfortable feeling for a person to be disliked by his companions. In order to win the friendship of the other generals, Lu Maofeng would always, intentionally or unintentionally, flaunt his connections. It seemed that in the capital he was a person whose hands and eyes reached the heavens. Face and reputation were also burdens. Now that Wu Yizong did not even let him enter the Yuan Gate, he had swept his face into the gutter. How could Lu Maofeng not be ashamed and angry at the same time? Su Liang said, Why don't I go see great General Wu Yi? After all, we, the 1,000 cavalry, belong to the Featherwood Guard in name. It is justifiable to ask great General Wu to come forward. Yang Fan thought for a moment and said, You go. You were originally 100 cavalry and are his old subordinate. It is more convenient to ask in private. Su Liang agreed and left the camp. Yang Fan looked at the indignant Chu Kuanga and the others and said, You guys disperse first. No matter what, I will rescue the people. But let me think of a way. This world has not reached the point where we can do whatever we want. Everyone could only disperse when they saw this. The angry and humiliated Lu Maofeng caught up and tried to salvage the situation. When I was leading the guards, I had a sworn brother who is now in the Jinwu Wei. The king of Hanoi does not want to see me, so I will ask this brother to take care of our captured people if possible. If there is any change in the news, he must inform me as soon as possible. Making such a request at this time would put his brother in a difficult position. The Jinwu Wei and the 1,000 cavalry camp were enemies. His brother was a member of the Jinwu Wei. Whether it was to help take care of the 1,000 cavalry camp or to report information, it was a big taboo. Although this information only talked about the situation of Gao Chu and the others in the Jinwu Wei and did not involve the defense of the enemy camp, it did not affect the victory or defeat of either side. But if it was known by others, it would not be a good thing for both sides. So, Lu Maofeng kept it to himself until there was no one else beside him. Only then did he tell Yang Fan. Yang Fan was moved and bowed to him. In terms of position, I am higher than you. In terms of age, you are older than me. In private, we don't care about official positions, we only talk about age. Brother Lu, ever since you came to the 1,000 cavalry camp, I have seen everything you have done and encountered. It's just that there are some things that are not convenient for me to say. It's also not convenient for me to seriously interfere just because of a small conflict. Brother Lu's background is something that you, I, and everyone else understands. That's why you are unavoidably treated coldly. Actually, this is human nature. Brother Lu is older than this little brother and has more experience. I'm sure you understand this. If we were in each other's shoes and someone insisted on shoving someone into Brother Lu's circle, I'm afraid Brother Lu would not like that person either. Lu Maofeng's face turned red and he did not know what to say. He did not know why Yang Fan suddenly brought this up. He was at a loss as to what to do. Yang Fan smiled and said, "But everyone has seen Brother Lu's actions after coming to our 1,000 cavalry camp. Brother Lu did not treat himself as an outsider. He did his best for our 1,000 cavalry camp. No matter how Brother Lu came in, Brother Lu's ability is worthy of this position. Brother Lu's sincerity towards our 1,000 cavalry camp is also worthy of being our brother. Brother Lu, do not take other people's prejudices to heart. Time reveals a man's heart. Everyone will eventually understand Brother Lu's character. Actually, I have long wanted to say these words to you. It's just that it was too abrupt to say it, so suddenly. Now that I have this opportunity, I can have a heart-to-heart talk with you." Lu Maofeng's eyes brimmed with tears when he heard this. He had indeed used Zhang's connections, but he did not have any backing in the army. Now that Zhang had prospered, and the ancestors of the two families were related by marriage, it would be a waste not to use this bit of relationship. Why couldn't he use it? So when Zhang slightly tried to recruit him, he agreed. But the army was not like the rest of the country. There was a system here, and it was difficult for Zhang's influence to seep in. He felt that his abilities and talents were not inferior to others, and he was even more sincere for the 1,000 cavalry camp. But there were always people who looked at him differently. They either felt that he did not live up to his reputation because he had used his connections, or they felt that he was a traitor planted by others. Because of this, he did not know how many times he had drunk in private and was extremely sullen. Now, Yang Fan's words made this man's heart warm up, and he could not help but tear up. Yang Fan did have an opinion of Lu Maofeng at first. Although he was very close to him at that time, he was purely using him at that time. But as he watched coldly from the sidelines, he had gradually changed his view of Lu Maofeng. Now he could still use the relationship between Lu Maofeng and Zhang as much as he could, but he no longer saw Lu Maofeng as a pawn to be used. Yang Fan's words were indeed from the bottom of his heart. As the saying goes, a friend in need is a friend indeed. He could do what you want to humiliate me and what you want to hate me. That was his brother. No matter what happened in the future, who would he choose between Zhang and himself? But Yang Fan wanted him to know, "You treat me sincerely, and I will treat you sincerely. Now we are brothers." It was already close to dusk when Su Liang returned. The news he brought back was not good. Wu Yi was different from the other Wu clan scions. He had always been the great general of the Featherwood Guard, and was in charge of the Imperial Guard's most elite force, as well as the army the Emperor trusted the most. He was already a king, and whether it was in terms of actual authority or rank, he could neither be promoted nor rewarded. There was no need for him to get involved in the struggle between the two Wu clans. Even though Wu Sanxi was gradually gaining the upper hand, the crown prince had already been decided, and Wu Sansi no longer had a share of the throne. There was even less of a need for him to curry favor with King Liang. Because of these reasons, he and the other brothers of the Wu clan walked rather far apart. Even though they were cousins, he and Wu Yizong were close friends. Was there a need for him to stick his neck out for the sake of 1,000 cavalry that was only under his name? Was there a need for him to lower his head and smile at that pig-riding fool? That was why he only agreed out of courtesy to Su Liang that he could send someone to negotiate with Wu Yizong, hoping that Wu Yizong would release him. However, Su Liang could naturally tell from his indifferent tone. When he returned and told Yang Fan about it, Yang Fan could only smile bitterly in response. Wu Yi couldn't be relied on either. Everyone discussed for half the night, but to no avail. The next morning, Yang Fan gathered Su Liang, Lu Maofeng, Li Dayan, Lu Yan, and a few other officers with steady temperaments to discuss a way to rescue Gao Chu and the others. Suddenly, a junior colonel came in and whispered a few words into Lu Maofeng's ear. Lu Maofeng bade Yang Fan farewell, then hurried back after leaving for less than an hour. Yang Fan saw that he seemed to have something to say to him, so he brought him into the small tent. Lu Maofeng said, "That sworn brother of mine has sent news. From Gao Chu to us, 16 of our brothers have been hung on a pole, whipped, and cursed by the king of Hanoi. Even now, they are still hanging from the pole." What? Yang Fan's body trembled. His blood boiled, and the veins on his forehead bulged. He knew that Gao Chu and the others would be humiliated after falling into Wu Yizong's hands, but he didn't expect that Wu Yizong would dare to torture them, especially when Gao Chu is a brigade marshal and an official general of the imperial court. Lu Maofeng bitterly said, "That sworn brother of mine said that he really has no way to take care of the 1,000 cavalry. Even when he sent out the news this time, he was in a dilemma. I'm afraid that if we want to ask for more information from him, he won't be able to say it." Yang Fan slowly nodded. He silently lingered in the tent for a long time, his expression uncertain. No one knew what he was thinking. After a long while, he seemed to have made up his mind. Suddenly, he turned around and walked briskly towards the big tent. Su Liang and the rest were discussing in the tent when they suddenly saw Yang Fan striding in with anger in his eyes. They couldn't help but shut their mouths and raise their heads to look at him. Yang Fan said in a deep voice, "There's no need to discuss anymore. I'll go to the Golden Guards to get them." As soon as these words came out, the 4 seats were silent. During the discussion last night, Chu Kuanga, Huang Shuchang, and the others were shouting about beating and killing them. Because of this, they were summoned alone today. What was going on? Why was Yang Fan so agitated instead? Su Liang stood up in shock and said, "No, you are the king of Hanoi. He won't let you go even if you go. Instead, you'll be humiliated again." Yang Fan said, "What else can we do? Our 1,000 cavalry and the Golden Guards are the Imperial Guards of the North. The Political Affairs Hall and the Ministry of War can't do anything about it. The Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court can't do anything about it. It'll be a joke if we go to the Luoyang government. Can't we go to the censorate to impeach Wu Yizong?" Su Liang's eyes lit up, and he said happily, "That's a good idea." Yang Fan laughed angrily and said, "The problem is by the time the censorate starts to spit saliva in the court, Gao Chu will already be a dried corpse, and his fiancée will also be a widow." Su Liang was shocked and said, "How could it be? Then what should we do?" Yang Fan said gloomily, "If the ceremony is over, then we'll send troops." Chapter 887. In front of the Jin Wu Guards gate, there was a market. On both sides of the road, there were small buildings of different heights. There were many lanterns and banners, and most of them were brothels and wine shops. It was noon, and the sun was scorching. The banners hung listlessly, and a few soldiers were eating and drinking in the tavern. There were also women in red dresses, sitting under the green eaves, sewing and mending clothes. The clothes in their hands were mostly military uniforms. Most of these women were prostitutes. The best prostitutes in Loyang were all at the Tongwenfang. Those who lived near the barracks were all old prostitutes. Sometimes they would take up sewing jobs, and other times they would open the door and entertain guests on the couch. The soldiers who frequented this place were all poor and didn't have much money, so they could only earn a few copper coins to spend. Under such a scorching sun, the sound of hooves could be heard. The hooves were not hurried, and the drunken soldiers in the tavern looked over. Suddenly, they saw 2 horses slowly approaching. Although they missed each other by a horse's body, their steps were in perfect unison. The 2 people on the horses were dressed in military uniforms, and their leather armor was black, as though it was cast from black iron. The woman who was sewing at the top of the building raised her head to take a look. When she saw the general's face, she couldn't help but be stunned. For a moment, she was lost in thought. What a handsome young general with red lips and white teeth! Aya! In a moment of carelessness, the needle pricked her finger, and a drop of blood flowed out. The woman hurriedly sucked her finger into her mouth, and as she watched the handsome young general slowly pass by, she actually felt shy like a young girl. The Jinwu guards had been stationed here for many years, and the military camp was surrounded by mud walls. The gate was also a tall and majestic stone base and was made of wood. On top of the gate there was a main and 2 side eaves. In front of the gate there was a flat open space, and houses were not allowed to be built here. To the right of the gate there was a stone archway, and on it were 4 big red words, Jin Wu Guards. To the left of the gate there was another stone archway, and the color of the stone was still very fresh. On it were 4 big words, Duke of Hanoi. It seemed like after Wu Yizong took control of the Jinwu Guards, he toppled the original archway and replaced it with his own title. The 2 stone archways were 50 steps away from the huge and majestic gate, and it was very grand. As the Chamberlain of the Chamberlain of the Chamberlain of Imperial Insignia was a permanent military camp, there weren't any tents inside. Looking in from the gate, one could see that there were many buildings on both sides of the road. However, as soon as they entered the gate, they saw a spacious activity area on both sides. There were many instruments placed on it, some made of wood and some made of earth. Yang Fan recognized them at a glance. They were the wooden horse and the earth horse. Unlike the Dragon Guard, the Chamberlain of Imperial Insignia wasn't entirely composed of cavalry, but they still had their own cavalry. If they had cavalry, they would have to be trained. As for horses, to be honest, a horse was more valuable than a soldier's life. So how could they be ridden at any time? Even if the cavalry was given a war horse, they didn't have the right to ride it at any time. The control was as strict as the weapons going in and out of the armory. How could the soldiers practice horsemanship? It was on these earth horses and wooden horses that he practiced the standard movements of mounting and dismounting a horse. The difference between the army's direct line of descent and the miscellaneous troops, as well as the distance between the army and the emperor, could be seen here. The people of the 1,000 Horseman Battalion could ride horses if they wanted to practice horsemanship. Since when did they need to use fake horses as a substitute? However, the Chamberlain of Imperial Insignia didn't have such conditions. If a war horse was injured or sick, it wasn't something that the Imperial Servant Monastery could change at will. At this moment, there were a few soldiers who were bare-chested and wearing a pair of trousers. They were exercising on the back of the wooden horse and earth horse that had long been polished smooth. The guards at the gate were enjoying the shade when they suddenly saw 2 well-armored generals approaching on horseback. They couldn't help but stand properly. The guards didn't know who they were, so they stood properly. They glanced at the 2 horsemen and saw them standing in front of the gate. One of the very young generals raised his head to look at the words on the gate before slowly lowering his head to look at them. The young general didn't look old, but his eyes were sharp and spirited. It made the guards even more uneasy. At this moment, another general beside the young general said, "Quickly report to the Grand General of the Chamberlain of Imperial Insignia." Just say that Guide Lieutenant General Yang Fan of the 1,000 Horsemen Battalion and Field Marshal Su Liang request an audience. Only then did the guards at the gate realize that the other party was from the 1,000 Horsemen Battalion. Their original uneasiness was instantly replaced by a kind of disdainful hostility. One of them glanced at the two coldly and said, "Wait." Then he walked unhurriedly into the camp. Under the scorching sun, Yang Fan rode steadily on the gate, not moving an inch. It was as if both he and his horse had become cast iron. The time it takes for a stick of incense to burn passed. Then two, but Yang Fan still didn't move. Sweat slowly trickled down his chin and lightly dripped onto his breastplate. The disdain on the faces of the guards at the gate grew more and more intense. They lazily returned to the shade and started chatting and laughing, no longer paying any attention to Yang Fan and Su Liang. After a full hour, the reporting colonel dragged his spear and slowly walked back. He said to Yang Fan, "The Grand General has something to say. Would General Yang please dismount and kneel to the marshal's tent to meet him?" Yang Fan raised an eyebrow and said in a low voice, "I am the guide, Lieutenant General. Although my position is lower than the King of Hanoi, how dare you humiliate me like this?" The colonel grinned and said, "If General Yang is unwilling, then please leave." Yang Fan said, "But what about the 1,000 horsemen captured by Grand General Wu?" The colonel said, "Those people have offended Grand General Wu and interfered with the Jin Wu Guard's work. They have been punished by the Grand General. You want to bring them back?" "No way." Yang Fan said, "Even if the 1,000 horsemen are in the wrong, it is not the Jin Wu Guard's turn to punish them. This is not the execution of military law. This is the indiscriminate punishment." The colonel laughed. "So what if it is? You can either kneel and beg our Grand General to be merciful, or you can leave." Su Liang raised his horse, and it took 2 steps forward. The frightened colonel hurriedly took 2 steps back and shouted, "If any of you dare to trespass the camp, the Grand General has orders to kill without mercy." As soon as the colonel finished speaking, a troop of soldiers suddenly charged out from the gate. They formed a formation on both sides of the gate and pointed their spears at Yang Fan. Yang Fan said sternly, "If it is to save my brothers, why should I kneel? However, my knees are worthless, but the dignity of the 1,000 horsemen is not to be offended. The Emperor's 1,000 horsemen would rather bleed than humiliate their dignity." The colonel laughed and wanted to say something, but Su Liang had already raised his hand, and with a bang, a firework exploded in the sky. The scorching sun was high up in the sky, and the sky was bright. Although there were not many fireworks, the sound was not soft. The sound of the firework was followed by the sound of people shouting and horses neighing in the distance. In just a moment, smoke and dust could be seen billowing. A large army turned into 3 torrents and rushed over from the 2 rows of houses. In the middle was a general wearing a black helmet. He was tall and sturdy, with thick eyebrows and a wide mouth. He dismounted from his horse and galloped forward. The spear in his hand shone with a bloodthirsty light. It was Chu Kwanga. Behind him were the horsemen, each of them pointing their spears forward like a gust of wind. On the left, there was a group of soldiers and horses. The person at the very front was holding a snow-white zamadeo, like an arrow that had just left the bow. The soldiers behind him formed groups of 3 and advanced in an arrow formation. This person was Ma Chiao. He had been in the Dragon Guard for many years and was the best at cavalry battles. The soldiers he led were also the best at cavalry battles. On the other hand, the army on the right side was different. The one leading the army was Huang Xuchang. This former commander of the 100 Cavalry Brigade had been in the Emperor's control center for a long time and had seen the nobles and generals every day. He saw them bowing and scraping in front of the Emperor all day long, so he really did not have any reverence for them. Thus, he held a horizontal saber in his hand and shouted arrogantly, looking even more powerful than Chu Kwanga. Of course, his soldiers followed suit, and the formation looked a little messy. They galloped forward and quickly shortened the distance between them and the gate. 800 steps, 500 steps, 300 steps. The earth trembled. The 1,000 horsemen that were galloping as fast as lightning did not have the slightest intention of stopping. The soldiers in front of the gate were dumbfounded. The halberds in their hands involuntarily drooped down. One of the captains was muttering to himself, "The 1,000 horsemen have gone mad. The 1,000 horsemen have gone mad. Run!" Someone beside him pulled him back in the spirit of brotherhood. Captain Jung, who was in a daze, turned his head and saw that most of his brothers had already run away. He hurriedly ran to the left and right as well. He wasn't that crazy to use his own body to block 1,000 crazy cavalrymen, other than the 100 men on duty in the palace. The entire 1,000 horseman battalion was mobilized. Like a broken dam, they charged into the main camp of the Jinwu guards and rolled forward along the main road. Yang Fan and Su Liang were bypassed by the soldiers and stood motionlessly in front of the gate. The billowing dust gradually dissipated, revealing the figures of Yang Fan and Su Liang. Other than them, there was no one else at the gate. The 1,000 horsemen had charged into the Jinwu guards, and the soldiers guarding the gate had fled. Su Liang let out a breath that he had been holding in for a long time and took a step closer to Yang Fan. He asked worriedly, "General, is it really all right to charge into the camp?" Yang Fan was silent for a while before he slowly said, "The people must be saved. The camp can only be charged. 100 men is a charge. Even if they turn out in full force, it's still a charge. Rather than causing a small ruckus, why not make a big one? Rather than making a fool out of himself, why not make a fool out of himself? I think that our current actions are more in line with His Majesty's taste." Su Liang rolled his eyes. He was asking if something would happen to him. Wasn't this the same as not saying anything? Wu Yizong was wearing a pair of underpants and enjoying the shade under a large tree. He was lying on a lounge chair drowsily when a soldier suddenly rushed over and shouted, "Mutiny! They're charging into the camp. General, leave quickly." Wu Yizong jumped up in shock and cried out, "Mutiny? How can there be a mutiny? This general has never been short of soldiers' pay." The colonel replied, "It's not our men. It's the 1,000 horseman battalion. The 1,000 horsemen are charging forward, and the entire army is in chaos. General, leave quickly. Those 1,000 horsemen seem to have gone crazy. It's hard to say what they won't do." Wu Yizong treasured his life the most. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done such a shameful thing back in Hebei. Once he heard that it was dangerous, he jumped up naked and wanted to hide in the bushes. The colonel didn't know whether to laugh or cry and said, "General, how can someone hide in such short bushes? Quick, 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 help me up the tree." Wu Yizong suddenly saw that the large tree he was enjoying the shade was lush with leaves and was suitable for hiding. Furthermore, it was unlikely that the enemy would search the tree, so he hurriedly shouted to the colonel. Immediately, the reporting colonel squatted down and let Wu Yizong step on his shoulder. He slowly carried Wu Yizong up the tree. Wu Yizong stepped on the fork and climbed up the tree in a flurry. He then poked his head out from the leaves and anxiously ordered, "Leave quickly and move the chair away." The colonel hurriedly moved the chair and ran away. Suddenly, there was the sound of galloping horses in the distance. Wu Yizong quickly retracted his head back into the leaves and grinned maliciously. "Yang Fan, you're the one who delivered yourself to me." Before he finished speaking, Wu Yizong suddenly felt a strange itch at the back of his neck. He stretched out his hand to grab it, and a colorful insect appeared in his hand. It was still struggling with its claws and fangs. Wu Yizong was so scared that he screamed and fell down from the tree. Chapter 888. Yang Fan's 1,000 cavalrymen charged into the Jinwu guards. When they reached the central tent, they put down the poles, saved their brothers, dragged their horses, and turned to leave. They came and left quickly, but in just a short while they had already turned the entire Jinwu guards upside down. Gao Chu and the others were hung on the poles for a day and a night. They were fine at night, but during the day they did not even have a drop of water to drink from the scorching sun. By the time they were put down, most of them were already unconscious. Looking at the situation, if this dragged on for another half a day, they would really die of thirst. Wu Yizong was truly audacious, actually daring to imprison the soldiers of his camp until they died because of a small dispute. These people were carried onto horses and immediately poured some water down their throats. Everyone woke up one after another. Chu Kuanga, Huang Xuchang, and the others had saved their brothers and were about to return to the cavalry camp in high spirits, but were stopped by Yang Fan. Was this a robbery by the Greenwood Mountain stronghold? You're going to leave after the fight? Don't forget that there was still the Son of Heaven above. After such a shocking act, you're just going to go back to camp? Yang Fan led them away from the Jinwu guards and went straight to the capital to find the emperor. Lu Maofeng did not participate in the attack on the Jinwu guards. When Yang Fan led his troops out of the camp, he had already rushed to the capital. Today, the one guarding the Black Tortoise Gate was Duguhuiji. Lu Maofeng did not have time to find Zhang Tongxiu and then find the second Zhang through him. Instead, he went straight to the Black Tortoise Gate and asked Duguhuiji to send a message inside. Not long after, Fengchen commander Zhang Yiji sent out a little eunuch, who handed him a token to enter and exit the palace, and led him straight to the Fengchen guards. Lu Maofeng stayed in the Fengchen guards for less than an hour before quietly leaving the palace. Meanwhile, the two brothers, Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong, rushed to Lichuan Tai to serve the empress. Before Yang Fan rushed to the palace, Zhang Changzong had just played the flute, and then it was Zhang Yiji's turn to play chess with Wu Zetian. The two did not care about winning or losing in chess. Wu Zetian was old and could not afford to waste her strength, so it was purely a pastime. The two played from time to time, and Zhang Changzong sat on the side to watch, chatting with the empress while picking up pieces. The two of them often told Wu Zetian about some of the interesting things that happened in the streets of Luoyang. Wu Zetian rarely entered the palace. In the palace, her hair had turned white and her face had aged. She liked to listen to the things that happened outside the palace. Perhaps the older one got, the more nostalgic they became. She had long held the power of a supreme being in her hands. She could not stop the aging of her face. She had spent most of her teenage years outside the palace, so listening to Zhang's stories became one of Wu Zetian's greatest pleasures. Zhang Yiji talked about all sorts of things and soon reached the conflict between the Golden Guards and the 1,000 Horseman Battalion. Fighting between soldiers was something that could not be prohibited since ancient times. The two used clever words and played it down. They described it as two groups of loyal men fighting over a quarrel, and the methods they used were nothing more than fists and legs. They also purposely made it more humorous. Wu Zetian found it interesting and did not think it was very serious. Zhang Yiji played chess as he said with a smile that Yang Fan is really bold. He actually dares to oppose the Golden Guards. Zhang Changzong moved the silver plate of ice closer to Wu Zetian and used a silver hammer to break a piece to increase the temperature. He said, "The 1,000 Horseman Battalion is Her Majesty's personal army. Are they not as noble as the Golden Guards? Why can't they oppose them?" Zhang Yiji rolled his eyes at him and said, "You really don't have a brain. If you want to beat a dog, you have to look at the owner. Don't you see who is in charge of the Golden Guards? Yang Fan's people beat up the Golden Guards. Isn't that just making Grand General Wu Yizong look bad? Look at the officers and soldiers of the North and South offices, who dares to disrespect Grand General Wu." Unconvinced, Zhang Changzong said, "Of course there are." He counted with his fingers and said, "Grand General Wu Yi counts as one, right? And Zhang Changzong counted with one finger and could no longer count. Zhang Yiji said with a smile, "How about it? There's only Yang Fan left. But speaking of which, Yang Fan's 1,000 horsemen also count as the Featherwood Guard." Huh. Isn't there only the Featherwood Guard in the 24 Imperial Guards? Do you think the other generals are stupid? Why don't they do things that offend people? Wu Zetian was still listening with a smile, but the smile on her face was becoming more and more stiff. Zhang Yiji was very alert, not saying anything more, and deliberately arguing with his brother for a while. The topic of conversation changed, and it circled around to a recent anecdote in the suburbs of the capital. It was said that a tenant named Yu Qingying made a double-continent bet with his gambling master. In the end, not only did he win the master's land and house, but he also won the master's wife. In the end, the master became a tenant, and the tenant became the master. Most Tangs liked to fight. Tang Taizong liked to hold and mold. Li Ji didn't have any special hobbies, and Wu Zetian was especially fond of double continents. Hearing about this matter, she put aside her worries and listened to them. Zhang Yiji acted as if he was watching the battle with his own eyes, and described this bet in an exaggerated manner. Wu Zetian was listening attentively, and Shanghai Wenner walked in. "Your Majesty," Wenner heard from the eunuch that there are soldiers kneeling outside the Black Tortoise Gate. "It's a black mass, and it's very scary. I don't know what happened." Hearing Shanghai Wenner's words, Wu Zetian, who was leaning on the soft cushion, immediately sat up in shock. She asked anxiously, "Why are soldiers knocking on the imperial palace?" Shanghai Wenner shook her head. "Wenner doesn't know. I've already sent someone to ask." Just as she finished speaking, Eunuch Xiao Hai, who usually attends to the emperor, came in to report. "Sage, Guide Zhonglong General Yang Fan requests an audience." Wu Zetian knew that the situation outside the Black Tortoise Gate had something to do with Yang Fan. She hurriedly said, "Let him in." A loud announcement was made outside the gate, and Yang Fan walked in proudly. When Wu Zetian saw him, her eyes immediately widened. Yang Fan was wearing a pair of trousers and a pair of military boots, but his upper body was naked. His arms were tied behind his back, and there were also a few thorns tied to his back. Was he going to carry thorns and ask for forgiveness? Zhang Changzong covered his mouth and laughed. "What is General Yang doing? Even if you are Lianpa, there is no Lin Xiangru here." Yang Fan knelt down on one knee with a military salute and said in a deep voice, "Minister Feng Qin must be joking. I am here to ask for His Majesty's forgiveness." Wu Zetian's face darkened, and she slowly asked what happened. Yang Fan said, "Following His Majesty's instructions yesterday, I first paid a visit to King Liang's place, and then returned to the barracks. I heard that the soldiers under my command had a conflict with the Jinwu guards, and 16 of them were captured, and a few of them escaped back to the barracks with injuries. A general in the army has already rushed to the Jinwu guards to demand their release. I hurriedly restrained my subordinates and quietly waited. When it was getting dark, that general rushed back and said that Great General Wu Yizong has an order, and if he wants the soldiers back, I will have to go personally." Wu Zetian frowned and said, "Then why don't you go?" Yang Fan said, "Great General Wu said that he wants me to kneel at the gate, kowtow with every step, and go to the main tent to ask for forgiveness before he will release the soldiers." "Pa!" Wu Zetian slammed her palm on the table, and the chess pieces were knocked into a mess, and she sternly scolded, "Scoundrel! Who does he think he is?" Yang Fan nodded and said, "As a member of the Emperor's personal army, I dare not disgrace the Emperor. However, it was already late, and if I had entered the city at that time, the gates would have been closed by the time I reached the city. As such, I wanted to wait until this morning to ask His Highness King Liang to mediate. Unexpectedly, just as I was about to enter the city, someone suddenly sent me news, saying that several of my subordinates were captured by the Jinwu guards at noon yesterday. They were first whipped, and their bodies were covered in cuts and bruises. Then they were hung on a high pole and exposed to the scorching sun. They have not had a drop of water for a day and a night, and many of them have already fainted, and are on the verge of death." Wu Zetian's expression became more and more gloomy. Yang Fan said in a sorrowful voice. When the 3 armies heard the news, they were worried about their comrades, and all of them were furious. I really could not suppress them. And Great General Wu is using his power to bully me. Yang Fan lowered his head and choked with sobs, and no one knew if he had shed a few tears of heroism. Shangguan Wan quickly turned her head away, fearing that she would burst out laughing if she saw her Longjuan's pretentious expression. But on second thought, her Langjun had really caused a great disaster today. Although she had tried her best to make up for it, His Majesty's mood was unpredictable, and she did not know if he would really be safe. She could not help but feel deeply worried. Yang Fan suddenly raised his head, and his voice suddenly became impassioned. His clear and high-pitched voice echoed throughout the hall. I am also a courageous man. I am someone who leads troops. If I continue to cower and bear with it, how can I please the people? How can I command 1,000 cavalry? I had no choice but to lead the entire army to the Jinwu guards and beg for Great General Wu's mercy. Under the scorching sun, I stood solemnly for 2 hours and lost count of the number of people who fainted. In the end, Great General Wu did not even want to see me and only sent a message. Either I kowtow with every step I take and kneel to the commander's tent to beg for forgiveness, or I return and leave my brothers hanging on a high pole to fend for themselves. I begged again and again and bowed my head again and again, but in exchange, Great General Wu took a mile after giving me an inch. I wanted to endure it, but I could no longer. I wanted to retreat, but I had no way out. I had no choice but to lead my men and charge into the Jinwu guards and rescue my comrades who were still hanging on a high pole under the scorching sun. Fortunately, I arrived in time. Although they had fainted at the time, they have now been saved. Although they are weak, they are not dead. I also know that even if I have 1,000 or 10,000 reasons, I am still wrong. I have committed a great mistake and have failed the Emperor's expectations. Today, I am here to beg for forgiveness, and even if I die 100 times, I will have no regrets. Even if I am to be executed, I will have no regrets. After Yang Fan finished, he nodded his head and did not say another word. The main hall immediately quietened down, but everyone's ears seemed to be reverberating with Yang Fan's sonorous and forceful voice. There was no expression on Wu Zetian's face. After a long time, she lightly said, So, what is your intention in leading the troops to the imperial palace? Yang Fan hurriedly said, The 1,000 horsemen kneeled to the imperial palace, not to confess their feelings, but to beg for forgiveness from His Majesty. Yang Fan paused for a while, then said, I know I am guilty, so I beg for forgiveness from His Majesty. I am willing to be punished by the country's law. As for the 1,000 horsemen general, I am only acting on my orders, so I beg for His Majesty's magnanimity and forgiveness. Wu Zetian asked, What about the people who were saved from the Jinwu guards? Yang Fan replied, I had someone feed them water, and although they have regained consciousness, they are still too weak. I am afraid that there will be further changes, so after entering the city, they were sent to the medical center for treatment. Upon hearing this, Wu Zetian's expression became slightly better. Sometimes one must look at a person's intentions, and it is more accurate to deduce from small details. If Yang Fan dragged back those soldiers who he said were half dead but did not treat them in time, and instead displayed them in front of the imperial palace for her to see, and even said that it was for the sake of his comrades and to beg for forgiveness, then his intentions should be put to death. But what should she do now? It's fine if the soldiers fight, but for a general to lead his men to charge into the camp, it is simply outrageous. Just as Wu Zetian was in a dilemma, Wu Yizong, supported by 2 fat eunuchs, tiptoed over. The pig-riding general climbed up the tree in a hurry, but was frightened by a bug and fell down. Unfortunately, there was a sharp stone on the ground that was poking into his tailbone. Hence, he ended up like this. Chapter 889. Aunt, you must uphold justice for your nephew. Wu Yizong relied on the fact that he was the emperor's nephew and barged in without sending anyone to report. As soon as he entered the main hall, he saw Yang Fan, who was offering a humble apology. He was stunned for a moment before he was enraged. Mother asterisk her. You barged into my camp and embarrassed me like this, and you dare to complain? Wu Yizong was enraged, and his buttocks no longer hurt, and his legs were no longer wobbly. He broke free from the support of the two fat eunuchs and rushed forward to kick Yang Fan. When Wu Zetian saw this scene, she immediately flew into a rage. Her nephew was half dead when he first came in, but now he's as lively as a dragon and a tiger? Was he acting pitiful just now? He even dared to beat up an official in front of me. How domineering is he? Wu Zetian was already prejudiced by Yang Fan's continuous hints and hints. Wu Yizong was so angry that he forgot his strategy. Wu Zetian's heart immediately tilted towards Yang Fan. Enough! A street brawl. How dare you be so presumptuous in front of me? Wu Zetian stood up and roared with her dragon head crutch. Wu Yizong said with grievance, "Aunt, you don't know." Wu Zetian said, "I know everything." She leaned on her dragon head crutch. Every time she stepped on the golden bricks, there was a kong sound. After walking 7, 8 steps, she suddenly turned around and glared at Wu Yizong, saying, "Let Chen ask you, a fight between soldiers is a small matter. You are the Grand Prince of Hanoi, a great general. Why did you rely on your power to capture 1,000 cavalry officers and men, first punish them with heavy punishment, and then hang them high on a pole, exposing them to the scorching sun, almost causing them to die?" Wu Yizong hurriedly said, "Aunt, your nephew did not rely on his power to commit a crime. Your nephew's men did not capture 1,000 cavalry soldiers because they were arrogant and out of line. That day, our golden insignia guards received a report that a group of bandits had gathered to rob a shop. The patrolling officers and soldiers quickly rushed to the rescue, but the soldiers of the 1,000 horsemen guards obstructed them. It was clear that they were secretly cooperating with the bandits, covering for them. They were accomplices of the bandits. Our Jinwu guards are responsible for the security of the capital, so it is only right for us to detain and interrogate them." Wu Zetian was still unaware of such a matter. She thought that the escalation of the fight was entirely due to the constant friction between the two sides. Hearing this, she could not help but look at Yang Fan and said, "There's actually such a thing? Yang Fan, what do you say?" Yang Fan said calmly, "I have never heard General Wu mention this before." Wu Yizong was enraged. "You dare to deceive the emperor? If one of you escaped, I don't believe that they wouldn't tell you about it." Yang Fan smiled and said, "Yes, they did say that to me. They said that on that day, they accompanied Brigade Commander Gao Chu to the wedding banquet. Your Majesty can investigate this matter. Gao Chu will be getting married in the next few days, but due to military duties he could not attend. Thus, they took advantage of the free time on that day to set up a few tables." Wu Zetian did not need to ask. Once she investigated this matter, she would know that Yang Fan would not dare to lie about this matter. She said in a deep voice, "Continue." "Yes," Yang Fan said. When they reached the long street, they suddenly encountered the patrolling officers of the Jinwu guards. They purposely collided with each other, and both sides started fighting. In the past, both sides only used their fists and legs. No one dared to use weapons. But this time it was very strange. The moment they started fighting, the Jinwu guards all drew their weapons at the same time and started fighting. My 1,000 horsemen were caught unprepared, and many of them were injured. Wu Yizong said, "**T. You shut up." Wu Zetian hit the ground with her dragon-headed walking stick and shouted, "We are questioning you. You are becoming more and more unruly." Wu Yizong swallowed his saliva and angrily shut his mouth. Yang Fan continued. Just at this time, a few thieves carrying sharp blades suddenly jumped out from a small shop by the side of the road. At the same time, A large group of Jin Woo guards suddenly appeared and blocked both ends of the long street. They then arrested my subordinates and those thieves together and accused my subordinates of covering up the criminals and our accomplices. Speaking up to this point, Yang Fan paused for a while before continuing. However, when I was earnestly negotiating with Grand General Wu, I did not hear Grand General Wu mention a single word about this matter. He kept saying that I only need to kowtow with every step and kneel to the commander's tent of Jin Woo guards to beg for forgiveness. There was no one present who did not understand what Yang Fan was trying to say. It was not difficult to verify this matter. If Wu Yizong had handled this matter carefully, and those thieves were real, they might have intentionally bribed the criminals and fallen into their hands long ago to trick others. How long has the 1,000 horsemen been established? The soldiers were also drawn from the various guards, so it was impossible for them to form a relationship with the local bandits and thieves in such a short period of time. Instead, this convenient condition belonged to the Jin Woo guards. The 1,000 cavalry battalion was guarding the palace. How could they help the thieves? Wu Zetian was silent for a while before turning to Wu Yizong and asked, "What do you have to say?" Wu Yizong replied, "Those thieves are indeed criminals and have been handed over to the Luoyang government. If Ant does not believe me, you can investigate and you will know. Since those people are criminals, the 1,000 cavalry battalion cannot absolve themselves from the blame." Wu Zetian looked at Yang Fan again. Yang Fan said, "When I was handling criminal cases in the autumn magistrate's office, there was a system of protecting the innocent in the judgment. Anyone who beats someone will be punished within a time limit. Beating someone with hands and feet, whether or not the person is injured, is limited to 10 days. Beating someone with other objects is limited to 20 days. Using a blade to hurt someone is not limited to size. Using fire or water to hurt someone is limited to 30 days. Breaking a bone or breaking a bone, regardless of whether it is the hands or feet or other objects, is limited to 50 days. Those who die within the time limit will be punished according to the crime of murder. His Majesty will definitely understand this principle." Yang Fan's words meant that there was such a rule in the imperial court called the system of protecting the innocent. For example, if two people were to fight, it is not based on the other party's injuries. There is also a period of observation because there is the problem of the worsening of injuries. Therefore, if one uses fists and feet to hurt someone, then from the day of the incident, one must be observed for 10 days. If the person dies within 10 days, then you will be charged with murder and not injuring someone. Of course, the person who dies within 10 days must be related to the fight. At the very least, you will not be able to find any other cause of death. You cannot say that if one was punched today and run over by a car tomorrow, it will be the responsibility of the perpetrator. Wu Zetian did not understand Yang Fan's intention, but she was very clear about this law. The law of Tang has been revised many times, and the law is an important power of the state. It must be reported to the emperor for discussion and approval. Wu Zetian nodded and said, "I am naturally clear about this." She briefly explained the meaning of the system of protecting the innocent and asked Yang Fan, "Why did you mention this matter? If the captured soldiers are killed or injured, will the Jinwu guards be held responsible?" Yang Fan said, "In front of His Majesty, everything will naturally be decided by His Majesty." What this subject means is that the imperial court has such a law. It is clear that everything must be done according to the order and cause of the matter. If today someone is falsely accused of murder, and this subject investigates the matter, punishes the real murderer, and clears the name of an innocent person, and this innocent person kills another person 10 years later, is this subject going to hold this subject accountable for judging him innocent 10 years ago? The conflict between the 1,000 horseman camp and the Jin Woo guards this time, whether there was an antecedent cause or not. If it was just a conflict, then Great General Wu's arbitrary decision, arbitrarily using the law, disregarding human life, was a serious crime. As for those thieves, whether they are real thieves or fake thieves, It depends on whether the 1,000 cavalry camp knew about it and if they are really covering for it. If the 1,000 cavalry camp has nothing to do with these thieves, then even if the thieves are guilty and the 1,000 cavalry camp did not know about it, in that case, Great General Wu's actions are also unreasonable and also guilty. Therefore, now we only need to investigate whether the 1,000 cavalry camp and those thieves know each other, and if there is any collusion, then the truth will be revealed. Yang Fan did not want to tangle with Wu Yizong on the details, and went straight to the crux of the matter. He said to Wu Zetian, "This subject begs your majesty to have the Ministry of Justice, the Supreme Court, and the Censorate to investigate and find out the truth. If my 1,000 cavalry camp is really colluding with the thieves, this subject is incompetent and does not know the right person. I am willing to be punished for both crimes." Wu Yizong heard this and thought to himself, "The Ministry of Justice is your home, and many people in the Censorate rose to their positions because of you. They owe you a favor. Moreover, they have always considered themselves to be clean and are very dissatisfied with my Wu family. As for the Supreme Court, they are not your people, but they are also not my people. If we think about it carefully, I am afraid they will be more biased towards you. What? 3 departments, joint investigation. Aren't you just finding people to take sides?" After hearing Yang Fan's words, Wu Zetian thought for a while and said, "All of you go out. I want some peace and quiet." Yang Fan and Wu Yizong looked at each other and said respectfully, "This subject obeys your majesty." It had been fine if he had just stood there without moving, but now he wanted to leave. After talking for a long time, his anger had mostly dissipated. Only then did Wu Yizong feel the pain again. He had 2 fat eunuchs help him out. Seeing this, Wu Zetian felt that Wu Yizong was putting on an act, which made her hate him even more. Yang Fan and Wu Yizong retreated to the outside of the hall and stood side by side. They looked at each other and really hated each other. Wu Yizong laughed coldly and said sarcastically, "Offer a humble apology? Only you can think of that. Leading troops to attack my Jin Wu camp, no matter how you look at it, you have committed a capital crime. Yang Fan, this day next year will be the anniversary of your death. At that time, I will burn some joss paper for you so that you won't be too down and out in the netherworld." Yang Fan smiled and nodded, saying, "This Yang has a son and a daughter. I do not need your highness to sacrifice for me." Wu Yizong was enraged, but after being reprimanded by his aunt a few times, he didn't dare to make a move. He could only laugh coldly and say, "You have a sharp tongue. So what if I let you have your way?" Yang Fan said, "Your highness has the demeanor of a gentleman. It seems that this Yang is stingy." "Thank you, thank you." As the 2 of them bickered inside the palace, Wu Zetian was full of misgivings, and it was hard for her to make a decision. This matter itself is not difficult to determine. Yang Fan mobilized his troops and attacked the Jin Wu guards' camp. Whether he was in the right or not, he must be guilty. Right now, all she had to do was investigate whether Wu Yizong was also guilty. What truly troubled her was the external influence of this case. It would affect the entire situation, making it difficult to judge. The northern part of the city was adjacent to the imperial palace, so there were very few commoners walking about. When the soldiers entered the imperial palace and kowtowed to the gate of the Black Tortoise, there was not a single commoner in this area. But even though the commoners of Luoyang could not see it, the news of so many soldiers kowtowing to the imperial palace quickly spread throughout the palace. The Prince of Xiang, Li Dan, and the former Prince of Luling, the current Crown Prince, Li Xian, who were in the middle of moving to the Eastern Palace, also heard the news. Li Xian immediately fell into a dilemma. Given the enormous kindness that Yang Fan had shown his family, now that he knew, could he still pretend to be deaf and mute? This favor, should he ask for it or not? Chapter 890. Consort Wei said, "Lang Jun, you should go." Li Xian hesitated. "But I don't know what mother means. If I act rashly and anger mother," Consort Wei said, "so what? Regardless of what happens to Yang Fan, you have to go. You didn't return to the capital peacefully. If someone else had come to pick you up, You might not be here right now, let alone become the crown prince. Even if the emperor doesn't want to spare him, what can he do to you if you go plead for him? Li Xian said, but I heard that Empress Mother gave a death order. If I live, he lives. If I die, he dies. That's why he did everything he could to protect me. It's not like he's loyal to the Li family. Zhongren said that his relationship with King Liang isn't shallow. You're muddle-headed. Consort Wei's face reddened with anger. His goal isn't important. What's important is what he did. If you were the emperor, would you carve out someone's heart to see if they were doing things for you out of loyalty to the emperor? What he did was beneficial to the country, the people, and you, so he should be rewarded. It doesn't matter why Yang Fan protected you. What's important is that you were able to keep your life because of him. Now that Yang Fan is in trouble, it's fine if you don't know about it. But who in the palace doesn't know about it? If you don't stand up, how will others look at you? If you can't even protect the person who risked his life to protect you, who will be willing to work for you? The ancients know that 1,000 gold pieces can buy a horse's bones. How can you not understand such a simple matter? Li Xian was a bit moved, but when he thought of his mother's dignity, he was still timid. He shook his head. Wife, this matter, let's wait and see. Father, mother. Following a crisp call, Li Bao rushed in with a flushed face. Have you all heard about Yang Fan trampling over the camp and trampling on the chamberlains of imperial insignia? Her older sisters were already married. She wasn't too old and could live in the palace for another 2 years. Otherwise, it would be unsightly for all her daughters to be married at once. Consort Wei angrily flung her sleeves and turned to enter the inner room. Li Gua looked at her mother's back in surprise, then looked at Li Xian, asking, Father, what happened to Mother? Li Xian anxiously said, Don't mention it. Your mother told me to go to your imperial grandmother and plead for Yang Fan. Your imperial grandmother has always been arbitrary and strict. How can I go and ask for trouble? When Li Gua heard this, she smiled and said, Father, don't worry, Uncle has passed away. Li Xian was startled and asked in surprise, 8th brother? He went to the emperor to plead for mercy for Yang Fan? Li Gua nodded and said, Yes. Just now I saw him hurriedly leaving the crown prince's palace. The young chamberlain said that uncle went to see his majesty to plead for mercy for Yang Fan. Oh, Li Xian stroked his beard and thought for a moment, a strange expression appearing on his face. In a corner of the eastern palace, Li Dan's sons were waiting for their father's return. They were originally going to move out of the eastern palace and return to the prince's residence today, but the incident of 1,000 horsemen suddenly occurred. Li Dan's second son, Li Qingyi, said, 3rd brother, didn't you say that Yang Fan is very close to the Wu clan? Why did you persuade father to plead for mercy for him? Li Longji was now a 15-year-old youth with red lips and white teeth. He had bright eyes and handsome eyebrows. His bearing was extraordinary. Hearing his second brother's words, Li Longji said, 3rd brother, you might not know, but I heard from Gao Lisher that Yang Fan is not only close to the Wu clan, but also to Antaiping. It's not impossible to win this person over. The current Li Longji was no longer the young man who had been angry at Yang Fan for echoing the Wu clan's words. He had been living in the palace all year round, and he had been trying to survive amidst all kinds of deceit and danger. He had already gained the ability to see through the surface of the problem. Li Longji said, This at least shows that Yang Fan's position between the Wu and Li clans is still uncertain. If our Li clan can plead for mercy for him and save his life in today's crisis, he will have to accept this favor no matter what. He controls 1,000 horsemen, and with his support, our Li clan's position will be more stable. 5th brother Li Longya was unconvinced. 7th uncle should be the one to say that. He is the crown prince, so why should we let our father do it? Li Longji dotingly rubbed his 5th brother's head and said with a smile, 5th brother, you should know that 7th uncle is the crown prince, so it's not convenient for him to do it. If seventh uncle does, Imperial grandmother might think that seventh uncle is trying to buy people's hearts. Father is just a prince, so it's more convenient for him to do it than seventh uncle. At least there won't be any suspicion of buying people's hearts. Li Dan had 6 sons. Other than his 6th son, who had died young, he still had 5 surviving sons. They were different from the other descendants of the imperial family, who had an apathetic relationship of blood and shallow brotherhood. Thanks to Wu Zetian's care, these 5 brothers had been locked up together since they were young, trapped within the walls of the Eastern Palace. They had gone through thick and thin together, so their brotherhood was very sincere. The 5 brothers of the prince of Xiang's clan were like the brothers of many impoverished families among the common people. To them, brotherly respect was no joke. It was truly like feet and hands. They were extremely close, brothers united in harmony, and a deep sense of righteousness and loyalty. For the son of Heaven's clan to have such deep brotherhood between brothers could be considered unprecedented in history. Wu Zetian slowly paced back and forth on the lovely spring platform, her mind in a dilemma. From what she had observed just now, she had already understood 80 to 90% of the truth of the matter. Investigate? If she really did investigate, then the thief was definitely real, but the Golden Guard's deliberate framing was also definitely real. Given her nephew's conduct and the massive difference in status, how could it be Yang Fan who had initiated the provocation? Yizong had been in the wrong first, and Yang Fan had been impetuous. One was the 1,000 cavalry camp, one was the Golden Guards, one was a close minister of the Son of Heaven, one was her own nephew. Was this case better treated as a misunderstanding, or was it better that one side deliberately framed the other and brazenly violated military discipline? From an even longer perspective, although she was inclined to protect Wu between the Wu and Li clans, she had been forced by the general trend to return politics to Li. This was because she understood that if she completely abandoned the Li clan, the Wu clan would lose the support of the people. Her nephews also did not have a single genius who could serve as a cornerstone, so the Wu clan would inevitably be abandoned. Thus, she had no choice but to return politics to Li and control the military to Wu. The establishment of the 1,000 cavalry camp was to balance these two factions, to give the Son of Heaven a certain amount of power to protect himself. This was not only for the future Son of Heaven, but also for the present Son of Heaven herself. After she had planned out the blueprint for the future regime, she began to strengthen the process of devolving military power to the Wu clan. However, she was also afraid that the Wu clan would take the risk out of desperation and launch a coup to seize the throne, even killing the person who had supported the Wu clan single-handedly. This kind of thing was not impossible. As an emperor, even his own son had to be on guard against the army, not to mention his nephew. Yizong took advantage of his power to bully others and pressured them step by step. If Yang Fan did not decisively rescue them and allowed his subordinates to be persecuted and killed by Yizong, how could he continue to lead the army? He also had his own difficulties. Zhang Yiji's words about the 24 guards of the capital, other than the Yulin guards, all submitting to the Wu clan, were still ringing in her ears. If she severely punished Yang Fan now, would it speed up the army's shift to the Wu clan? Although this was her goal, she did not want even the fulcrum that balanced the power of the Wu and Li clans to disappear. Furthermore, she did not want the army to start looking for another master while she was still alive. The more Qingxi's illness grew, the more the Wu clan gradually leaned toward Sanxi. But what about her? She was also old, getting older and older. Could she not be abandoned by those people who only cared about profit? The fact that Yang Fan was able to defeat the main camp of the chamberlains of imperial insignia with 1,000 cavalrymen proved that he was indeed an elite troop. If Yang Fan, the chess piece used to balance the situation, her entire setup would fall apart. However, if she did not punish him, she would not be able to justify it. The dispatch and command of the Southern Palace Imperial Army was under the jurisdiction of the Political Affairs Hall. At the same time, it also needed her approval. Whenever an army of more than 10 people was dispatched, unless it was an emergency, there must be an imperial edict and a tiger seal from the emperor issued by the Shangshu province and the Minxia province. The Northern Palace Imperial Army was directly under the emperor, so it was less restricted. However, it had never done something like Yang Fan. If she did not punish him, Wu Zetian thought about it and was full of worries. At this moment, Little Hai came in and reported, "Sage, the Prince of Xiong requests an audience." Oh! Wu Zetian thought for a moment and understood why her son had come. She originally did not want to see him, but she changed her mind and said, "Tell him to come in." Standing in front of the hall, Wu Yizong and Yang Fan watched as the Prince of Xiong, Li Dan, entered the lovely spring platform. After about the time it takes for 2 incense sticks to burn, Li Dan came out of the hall and walked past the 2 of them. After a while, the eunuch Little Hai came out of the hall and stood on the steps. In a clear voice, he said, "His Majesty's verbal decree." Wu Yizong and Yang Fan bowed slightly. Little Hai said, "Yang Fan, quickly order the 1,000 cavalry to return to camp. All soldiers are not to discuss today's matter. The soldiers are to return to camp. Yang Fan is to return to the estate to await his report." Yang Fan secretly sighed in relief. Since he had not been punished on the spot, even if he was guilty, the consequences would not be too severe. He clasped his hands to the director of the lovely spring platform and turned to leave. Wu Yizong glared fiercely at him, then suddenly turned his head to look at Little Hai. Little Hai leaned to the side and said, "The saints summon you. Great General Wu, please." Wu Yizong swung his sleeve and angrily walked into the hall. The moment he saw Wu Zetian, he said, "Aunt, the facts are before us. Yang Fan was audacious to the extreme and should have been executed. Aunt, how could you let him go?" Wu Zetian's face darkened. "Did you really think that we didn't know about those shameful things you did?" When Wu Yizong saw that Wu Zetian was angry, he shrunk his neck back and said nothing. Wu Zetian snorted, then said, "The Golden Guards had 40,000 soldiers, but they were utterly defeated by a trifling 1,000 people. You truly led a good army." Wu Yizong straightened his neck and said, "Aunt, that was different. Your nephew didn't think that he would be so daring. He was completely unprepared." Wu Zetian paused with her dragon crutch and scolded. "Then in Jiaozhou, when your 100,000 soldiers were scared away by a mere chiton cavalry of less than 1,000, you were also completely unprepared." Wu Yizong's face immediately turned red. He stammered for a moment, unable to respond. Wu Zetian coldly glanced at him and said, "Go back and restrain your soldiers. In the future, if there is another battle, we will only hold you accountable." Wu Yizong stammered. Then this time, Wu Zetian said, "This matter only happened between your 2 camps. Outsiders don't know about it yet, and they don't know the details. You can't make this public. You've already embarrassed yourself enough. If this goes on, how can I give you the authority to station troops in Jingdo? As for how this matter should be handled, we have our own plans." Chapter 891. It was a summer afternoon in the backyard of the Yang family, and it was cool under the trees. There were a few mats on the ground, which made up a large area. Yang Fan and his family were resting under the trees. In the middle of the mats, there was a shiny wooden table with all kinds of fruits, snacks, and drinks on it. There were iced sour plum soup and sour sheep's milk as drinks, but Yang Fan was used to drinking tea now. Tea was the best to quench his thirst, especially in summer. Moreover, the Tang people's diet was mainly meat, as long as the family's financial situation allowed it. Drinking tea had the effect of refreshing oil. Yang Fan gradually tasted the taste and told his wife. Now, not only Yang Fan liked to drink tea, but also Xiao Man and Anu had developed the habit of drinking tea. Now, when Xiao Man went to the shop to do the accounts, she would always put a cup of tea beside her. Yang Yanzu had become more and more robust. He had a cute peach heart shape on his head and a lock of black hair in front of his forehead, which made him look particularly cute. He wore a sleeveless floral gown and held a bamboo pole. The end of the pole was bent with a bamboo strip, and he was sticking cicadas. How could he really catch cicadas with his loud voice? He was just having fun. When the spider web was broken, third sister would patiently wrap a few more layers of the pole, and then the silly boy would happily continue his great cause of catching cicadas. Si Rong was much quieter than her brother. She sat on the mat, with a pile of clay dolls, cloth dolls, and wooden dolls in front of her. She was very focused on playing with the dolls, and she was also mumbling something, probably arranging these dolls to play house. Xiao Man was holding a lady bamboo in her arms and was dozing off on the mat. Last night, Yang Fan slept with Anu, so the children naturally came back to sleep with their mother. Unexpectedly, the little sentry eggs were even more annoying than Yang Fan. First, they refused to sleep, and then they asked her to tell them stories. Finally, they fell asleep, but it was easy to wake up in the summer night. One got up in the middle of the night, and the other looked for their mother. She didn't sleep well all night, and now she was sleepy. Anu sat at the side, attentively threading a needle and sewing a small piece of clothing. In fact, with the Yang family's current family business, there was no need for Anu to make her own clothes. Not to mention the tailor shop in the square. There was also a needlemaker in her house. But to make a shirt for her own children was a very different feeling. Yang Fan did not directly sit on the banquet. Instead, he set up a leisure chair on the bamboo chair. Yang Fan lay on the bamboo chair with his eyes closed. He looked as if he was sleeping, but in fact he was thinking about something. He had already made a move, but he didn't know how Mu would react. So far, he didn't notice of Shinmu. In fact, if the clues of Song Batty and Dragon 9 were left untouched, it was possible to figure out Shinmu's plan from their actions. That was what the old gentleman of Heaven's pivot had suggested to him. But after thinking it over, Yang Fan thought that he would rather not take the risk without knowing Shinmu's purpose. One had to know that his greatest advantage in dealing with Shinmu was the power of the officials. If he allowed Shenmu's people to form a relationship with the most favored second Zhang, once they found a way to involve second Zhang, then his greatest advantage would disappear. At that time, even if he understood Shenmu's intentions, what use would it be? He wasn't very worried about leading people to attack the Jinwu guards. Since he was ordered to stay behind closed doors, then there was still room to maneuver. Otherwise, with the fact that he mobilized troops without permission, he could have been dealt with immediately. Whether this matter should be dealt with lightly or heavily depended on the emperor's whims. Mobilizing troops without permission was a big taboo, but the cause and process of the matter was due to the discord between the two generals, which developed into frequent conflicts between the soldiers under the two. If the emperor had enough trust in him, then he could completely understand this matter as a larger-scale group fight. The nature of the matter was different, and the punishment wouldn't be as severe. As Yang Fan was pondering, his arm was suddenly touched by someone. Yang Fan opened his eyes and saw Anu had stopped her needlework. Her beautiful and alluring red lips were moving towards him. Yang Fan was stunned for a moment, then revealed a mysterious smile and returned a knowing look to her. Yang Fan's expression was wrong, causing Anu to be stunned for a moment. Then she came to her senses and blushed. This shameless fellow, what are you thinking about? Now that she was pregnant, Yang Fan often stayed in her room just to take care of his beloved wife's emotions. It was impossible for him to think about the matters between a man and a woman. But sometimes when he was aroused and faced with his beloved wife, he would not force himself to restrain himself. For example, last night, after a series of begging, Anu half-heartedly leaned towards the jade flute and pressed her lips against his. Unexpectedly, Yang Fan seemed to have tasted it. Seeing her pouting, he actually thought of such shameful matters again. Anu glared at him, her beautiful red lips pressed into a line. Her slender, jade-like fingers held a silver needle and pointed behind Yang Fan. Only then did Yang Fan understand. Turning his head, he saw Tao Mei standing there. Thinking that Tao Mei had something to report, but seeing that he was dozing off, she did not dare to wake him up. Yang Fan asked, "What is it?" Tao Mei presented a letter with both hands and said in a low voice, "From Princess Taiping's residence." Yang Fan understood and took the letter. With a light wave of his hand, Tao Mei retreated. Yang Fan opened the letter. There was only a thin piece of paper inside. After reading it carefully, Yang Fan's lips slowly curled into a smile. "All of you rest first. I'll make a trip to the study." Yang Fan said to Wan Nu, who had her head lowered as she sewed. Her heart was filled with joy as she looked forward to becoming a loving mother as soon as possible. He then stood up and walked confidently towards the study. The incident that happened between the 1,000 horsemen camp and the Jinwu guards was not known by the common people. The only people who saw the 1,000 horsemen move were the people in the wine shops and brothels in front of the Jinwu guards' encampment. Moreover, they only saw the 1,000 horsemen pass by aggressively and did not know what happened after that. As for after they entered the city, because they went through the north gate, they turned directly towards the palace. Thus, the common people in the city did not know about it. However, this incident was known by everyone in the palace. Through the mouths of the internal palace maids, this matter quickly spread to the outer court, and then through the internal servants of the Political Affairs Hall, Hanlin Academy, and the Hall of History to the ears of the officials. Very quickly, this matter was no longer a secret in the imperial court. Almost all the imperial censors in the capital submitted a report to impeach Yang Fan. Those in their positions had to plan for their own affairs. Such a major matter, they could not pretend to be unaware. Thus, even the imperial censors who had a good relationship with Yang Fan or had a good impression of him had to report to the emperor. The only difference was that some people only severely impeached Yang Fan, while others punished both Yang Fan and Wu Yizong. Wu Zetian still couldn't make up her mind. It wasn't difficult to punish Yang Fan. She could behead him, exile him, demote him, or take away his salary. There were many ways to do so. The problem was that Wu Zetian wanted to find a way to punish him. This way, she would be able to explain herself to the nation's laws and regulations, but it wouldn't affect her own political plans. On the second day after the imperial censors submitted a report to impeach Yang Fan, Prime Minister Yao Chong spoke to the emperor. He believed that Yang Fan had a rash and impulsive personality and was not qualified to command 1,000 horsemen. He recommended the left commander Zhang Hao to the emperor, saying that this person had a calm personality, was honest and prudent, and had a reputation in the army. He was qualified to command 1,000 horsemen. Wu Zetian did not express her opinion on the surface, but she was very unhappy in her heart. The emperor had always regarded the northern Yamen as his own backyard. Not to mention that Wu Zetian had always been under too much pressure because she was a woman and had always been suspicious of the emperor. Even Li Shimin had always regarded the northern Yamen as his exclusive property and did not allow others to touch it. In the 15th year of Jingguan, the Xuanwu Gate in Chang, and was being renovated. After hearing this, Prime Minister Fang Xianling and Gao Shilian inquired about the progress of the Xuanwu Gate's renovation from the junior supervisor of the Ministry of Finance. Li Shimin was very unhappy after hearing this. He specially found Fang Xianling and other prime ministers and warned them, "You should just take care of the southern Yamen. The northern Yamen has nothing to do with you." Now that Yao Chong coveted 1,000 horsemen, Wu Zetian was very unhappy. Back in the harem, the Zhang brothers led the beautiful young men of the Fengqin prison to present a large-scale song and dance that they had just rehearsed to Wu Zetian. Only then did Wu Zetian's gloomy mood slightly dissipate. While she was beaming with joy, Zhang Yiji, in a roundabout way, hinted to Wu Zetian that he wanted to put one of his cousins into the army and lead 1,000 horsemen. Wu Zetian, who was dissatisfied with Yao Chong's overstepping his authority, was extremely sensitive at the moment. When she heard Zhang Yiji's words, she immediately refused. In the past, whenever the Zhang brothers performed a song and dance to make her happy, she would ask them to stay in bed with her. But this night, she was not in the mood and went to sleep alone. The news that Wanchong and Zhang Yiji had their eyes on the 1,000-horseman camp and had recommended wise men to the emperor quickly reached the ears of Wu Yi, the general of the Yulin Guard. Wu Yi was afraid that the 1,000 horsemen would fall into the hands of others, so he quickly went to recommend them to the emperor. As a result, he naturally met with a rebuff that was neither soft nor hard. Wu Yi had just left when Wu Sanxi smelled the scent and ran over. The unhappiness that Wu Zetian had accumulated from Yao Chong, Zhang Yiji and Wu Yi had already turned into a thunderous rage by the time Wu Sanxi rushed over. Wu Sanxi was scolded until his head was sprayed with dog blood, and he left in a sorry state. Immediately after, an imperial decree was quickly transmitted to the Yang residents. Promote Yang Fan to the rank of loyal general. Yang Fan had been promoted. As soon as the news came out, the officials who did not know the inside story were only shocked at Yang Fan's imperial favor. The officials who knew the inside story could not help but secretly laugh at Li Dang, Wu Dang, and Zhang Dang's eagerness for doing all this for nothing. The officials who knew the inside story did not dare to say anything to incur the emperor's displeasure, and the officials who did not know the inside story would not dare to offend the emperor's favorite. Therefore, the strange phenomenon of Yang Fan being promoted instead of being punished could only be said by the censors, who were always upholding justice and speaking up for justice. However, the words of the censors had to be listened to by the emperor. If the emperor was willing to listen, it would be swords. If the emperor was not willing to listen, it would be spit. This time, the censors' remonstrance was undoubtedly spit for nothing. Yang Fan's promotion had nothing to do with his authority. He was still in charge of 1,000 cavalrymen. Be it loyal general or guide commander-in-chief, those were just ranks. What was related to rank was not authority, but treatment. For example, salary, exemption from classes, punishment, order of class, carriage, clothing, etc. Other than that, it also involved retirement, conferment of nobility, purchase of property, construction, funeral, posthumous appointment, etc. A guide, Zhonglong general, was a lower secondary rank 4, while a loyal marshal general was a higher secondary rank 4. Yang Fan skipped the upper secondary rank 4 and lower secondary rank 4 and was directly promoted to the upper secondary rank for loyal marshal general. He had actually been promoted 3 times. Yang Fan was promoted despite being guilty. What kind of logic was that? It was indeed illogical. However, did Wu Zetian need to reason with him? Chapter 892. The bright moon hung in the sky, and the light clouds covered it. Under the moonlight, a small building was like a poem or a painting in the hazy artistic conception. The small building was richly ornamented, but many of the exquisite beauty was lost in the darkness of the night. At this time, it could not be seen clearly, but that kind of elegant and luxurious temperament could still be faintly revealed. This was a girl's embroidery building. The upstairs was still lit, and the dancing shadows of the bamboo reflected on the green screen window. When there was no wind, it seemed like a few bamboo leaves attached to the window. Inside the boudoir was full of a delicate and gentle atmosphere, rippling with the unique light fragrance of a girl's boudoir. On the screen were lake stone flowers and butterflies, and the color was just right. The top-quality sandalwood table, stool, table, shelf, everywhere flowed with the delicate and gentle feeling of a girl. Next to the window was a bookcase with curled ears and carved flowers. On the desk were all kinds of famous people's calligraphy and several precious inkstones. Inside the brush pot and brush holder were either inserted or hung, all filled with purple ink. On the wall was a picture of a pair of chests in a lotus pavilion, and on the left and right hung a pair of couplets. The ink was dripping, as if it wanted to seep out of the paper. Against the wall was a frame bed with 4 pillars and 4 poles, beautifully carved. The curtain was hung high, but it was not put down. The light reflected on the 2 people on the bed. A crimson gauze nightgown was still wrapped around Wanner's body. Her skin was like ice and jade, and her soft breasts and pink legs were faintly discernible, making her even more charming. And Yang Fan was buried in this pink, snow-white, and jade-like body, hugging that astonishingly thin waist, as if he was trying hard to suppress the twisting, jumping, and struggling catfish under his body. The sturdy frame bed made a creaking sound. The sound of the creaking became louder and more urgent. Suddenly, the creaking sound came to an abrupt stop, accompanied by a sound from someone. It was as if a passionate picture had been frozen. On the screen, there was only one place that was still moving. It was a pair of snow-white, slender, round, and firm thighs. Those thighs were tightly wrapped around Yang Fan's waist, and they were still twitching uncontrollably, the muscles of the thighs suddenly trembling. Gradually, that beautiful, tightly curled toe with bright red cardamom slowly stretched out, like a blooming flower in the spring breeze. Then a pair of snow-white, round, and smooth thighs, like someone had suddenly pulled out the bones, softly slid down, accompanied by a delicate moan. Panting, Yang Fan held up Wanner's little face and kissed her sweaty forehead with pity. He laid down next to her, as if he was afraid of crushing her. Looking at his tender and protective appearance, it was really hard to tell who the man who had been pounding on her body was. Wanner's heart was still beating rapidly. Her skin was hot and suffused with a rosy red. Her cheeks were still flushed, her almond-shaped eyes were still blurry, and her full breasts were heaving up and down. But as Yang Fan lay down on his side, she seemed to be glued to Yang Fan's body. She immediately turned over and squeezed into his embrace, as if she still felt that he was not heavy enough just now. Yang Fan gently stroked her soft and fragrant hair, as well as her soft and delicate back, which was slightly rough because of the sweat. Wanner comfortably nestled in his embrace, like a cat that had just swallowed a fresh fish. After a long, long time, she faintly sighed and said, "I really want a child." Yang Fan's hand froze, and then he gently wrapped his arms around her and slowly tightened his embrace. They listened to each other's fierce heartbeats, but did not speak. Wanner regretted her words and quickly changed the topic. She sneered and said, "This method of yours is really clever. The saint is very suspicious, and you used her suspicion. In the end, not only did you not receive any punishment, but you were promoted. You made me worry for nothing." Yang Fan used his nose to rub against her nose and said, "Do you want me to be punished?" Yang Fan lay flat and sighed. He casually put an arm behind his head and looked at the top of the tent. He slowly said, "Do you think I was not worried in the beginning? No one could predict the result, and no one could be sure what the Emperor's reaction would be. But I had to do what I had to do. All that was left was to do my best to make up for it and lessen the punishment. At the beginning, I also expected to be punished. I just hoped that the punishment would not affect my control of the 1,000 riders. I was quite sure of this. Later, I found that the Emperor had many misgivings and did not impose any punishment on me. I had a plan in my heart. Only now did I think that perhaps doing this would not only not be punished, but it might have other miraculous effects. Speaking of this is also due to your efforts. You and the Zhang brothers have helped me a lot, haven't you?" Wanner said lazily, "Saints are extraordinarily intelligent, but it is a pity that they are too smart. They act in the opposite way and say more bad things about you. The effect is even better. That's why they've been saying a lot of bad things about you these past few days. As for Heir Zhang, they've been too close to you recently. If they say bad things about you, they'll make His Majesty suspicious. They've only praised Wu Sanxi and Wu Yizong's power." Yang Fan laughed a few times and then became silent. He gently caressed the smooth skin of Wanner's thigh and slowly said, "In the recent days, there will be a few reports about the grain problem." Wanner understood and nodded gently. Yang Fan and Wanner had not married yet. The ruler could marry, but they could not become husband and wife. In the beginning, it was because Yang Fan's position was low and Wu Zetian relied heavily on Shanghai Wanner. Once a person who had helped her deal with things was used to it, no one could replace him. the ability to control big and small matters, the importance of military and politics, the understanding of the emperor's attitude. All of this required a lot of time to get used to, and a lot of energy to train him. She would not give up this capable assistant for the sake of Yang Fan. Now, Yang Fan's position was becoming more and more important. He could be considered one of Wu Zetian's confidants, so this kind of thing could not be mentioned. The palace could use female officials, but there was absolutely no reason to use the wife of an official. Husband and wife being officials in the same court, one civil and one military, one inside and one outside. No ruler could accept this. Furthermore, it was impossible for Yang Fan to have any emotional entanglements with Wanner, who was deep in the palace. If the emperor knew that they were in love, Wu Zetian could immediately think of many things. Past, present, future. At that time, it would be difficult to guess what the empress's intentions would be. But those who should be husband and wife could not be husband and wife, and those who should not be husband and wife were forcibly brought together by Wu Zetian. Li Chongxiu and Lady Zhang were going to get married. When officials became rich, they could take concubines, but rarely would they divorce their wives. Loyalty, filial piety, benevolence, and righteousness, and other qualities were very important. Those who were unfilial to their parents, the court would not think that they would be loyal to the country. Those who despised the poor and loved the rich, no one would believe that they would become an upright official with noble character. If you abandoned your wife, who had gone through thick and thin with you, when you were at the end of your career, it would be a huge stain on your political reputation in a society that was based on feudal ethics. Your career and reputation would be greatly affected. However, under Wu Zetian's increasing pressure, Li Chongxiu still divorced his wife. His mother was originally a servant girl and had a lowly status. She was repeatedly invited into the palace by the empress and treated with courtesy, which made her feel flattered. After she learned of the emperor's intentions, she also began to persuade her son. Li Chongxiu had his mother's persuasion internally and the emperor's pressure externally. In the end, he could only obey the emperor's arrangements. But this wedding was not held at the Li family. Lady Zhang had changed her marriage. Of course, she could not continue to live in her late husband's home. This new residence was bought and decorated by her son, Zhang Yiji, for her. In the end, it was still considered the property of the Zhang family. In this way, Li Chongxiu was no different from becoming a live-in son-in-law. At that time, those who were willing to become live-in son-in-law were people who were so lowly that they had no means of livelihood and were unbearably poor. Li Chongxiu first divorced his wife and then married into the family. For a time, his reputation was ruined. His former colleagues, friends, relatives, and friends all looked down on his character and behavior. They all kept a respectful distance, and no one came to congratulate him. In order to make his mother's wedding a grand and lively event, Zhang Yiji sent out invitations and invited all the famous people to attend the wedding banquet. With their reputation, they were naturally able to invite many famous people. These famous people actually came because of the second Zhang. They did not have to worry that others would criticize them because of Li Chongxiu, this moral scum. Li Chongxiu was the groom, and the guests were all famous people in Jingdou. He had to personally welcome them. Every time he welcomed a guest, no matter if the other person sincerely congratulated him or casually brushed him off, he, who had a psychological problem, always felt that the other person was mocking him. His face was boiling hot from the beginning. In the eyes of those who did not know, they would think that this groom was very excited to be able to climb up to the Zhang family and despised him even more in their hearts. Princess Taiping was also invited to the new residence. A banquet was specially set up in the inner residence for these female guests. Princess Taiping, Princess Qianjin, Princess Anil, and a group of Lady Zhang's famous friends were all under the guidance of Lady Zhang to tour her bridal chamber. In order to create a love nest for his mother, Zhang Yiji could be said to have taken great pains. The luxury of the bedroom was unheard of, not to mention other things. Just the wedding bed was already so luxurious that even the empress, who was the mother of the world, had never had the fortune to enjoy it. This bed was known as the Seven Treasures tent. It was filled with gold, silver, pearls, jade, and all kinds of rare treasures. Spread the ivory bed, woven the horn of a rhinoceros, the mattress of a marten, the carpet of a fly, the beard of a dragon from Fingine, and the bed of a phoenix in the river. Liguier had never seen such a priceless treasure bed. She touched it here and there, unable to conceal the envy on her face. Even when Princess Taiping saw it, she could not help but sigh to Princess Tianjin, "Look at where she is sitting. We can only be considered to have wasted our lives." Princess Tianjin agreed deeply and could not stop nodding her head in agreement. Yang Fan, who had been promoted to the rank of General Loyalwu, was also invited today. Today's guests included the Zhang faction, the Li faction, the Wu faction, and other influential figures in the capital. Yang Fan, the new favorite of the emperor, could not be considered a big shot among them. Moreover, his current position was too vague. It seemed that he was really following the emperor's plan, walking towards a position where he would have connections with any faction, but it would be difficult for any faction to take him as a confidant. Therefore, no one from any faction would have too much contact with him under the watchful eyes of the crowd. This made Yang Fan, who was sitting in a corner, feel very relaxed. Yang Fan and Chen Dong sat side by side in the corner. They looked at Li Jingxiu, who was walking in with a radiant face, accompanying a few guests who had just arrived. He shook his head sympathetically and raised his cup to take a sip of wine. He savored the sweet and mellow wine and let it slowly flow into his stomach. Suddenly he thought, those few memorials should have been sent to the emperor. Today Lady Zhang was getting married. Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong had left the palace. A group of beautiful youths from the Fengqian Institute also followed them to Lady Zhang's new residence to celebrate. The lovely spring stage was deserted. Wu Zetian rushed to Hall of Martial Accomplishment to read the memorials. Ever since she threw her son off the throne, going to Hall of Martial Accomplishment to read the memorials became her daily homework. It was only in the last 2 years that she could relax. Today, she was revisiting her old dream and was in high spirits. There were plenty of ways for the people working beside him to notice certain things that were happening in a superior position. Wanner's method was very simple. She reduced the number of other important memorials. Thus, in a pile of small problems that could only be considered trifling matters to the emperor, she could easily find the only important point. The first memorial that Wu Zetian noticed was the imperial censor Su Yougong's Qing Taiyuan prepared grain to benefit the people. Chapter 893. The people were the foundation of a country, and food was the heaven of the people. In a feudal empire where agriculture was the foundation, if there was no food crisis, ambitious people, no matter how many reasons they had, would rarely be able to overthrow the regime. Thus, food had always been the foundation that a dynasty placed the greatest importance on stabilizing its foundation. But the Central Plains Empire had vast territory and transportation was inconvenient, information was blocked, and the emperor sat in the imperial palace, making it very difficult for him to keep track of the production, consumption, and storage of food. Thus, the government had devised a system for auditing grain storage and verifying accounts. This department of auditing grain storage was not located in the Bureau of Revenue, which was in charge of money and grain, but in the Bureau of Justice. Its purpose was to prevent the Bureau of Revenue from colluding with the provincial governments, which were directly in charge of grain storage, from working together to embezzle grain. The grain of the capital was audited quarterly, and the grain of the prefectures and prefectures was audited annually. The prefectures would first report to the Bureau of Revenue, and the Bureau of Justice would sort out the statistics and then report to the Minister of State. The Bureau of Justice would then report to the department responsible for auditing grain storage, and if there was a problem, the Imperial Censorate would investigate. Su Yougong's memorial had not mentioned any problems with the grain storage, but had recommended that the imperial court release the grain storage in Taiyuan to stabilize prices. Taiyuan was the place where the Tang dynasty had flourished, so it had always been an important place for the country. At the beginning, the places with the most grain had been Taiyuan and Luoyang. It was said that Taiyuan was a granary of millions, while Luoco was the millet of the world. On the other hand, the capital of Chang and the inconvenience of transportation and frequent droughts had resulted in a severe shortage of grain. During Gaozong's reign, the imperial court had moved to Luoyang many times precisely because it was impossible to feed the officials in Chang. And from the end of Gaozong's reign until the recapture of Anqi town, the country had not engaged in any large-scale wars, and it had always placed great importance on agricultural production. It had been at least 15 to 16 years since the country had experienced a large-scale natural disaster like the one Teneno had experienced in his youth, so the country had an ample supply of grain. Su Yogong's memorial said that when he was inspecting the grain storage in Taiyuan, he had noticed that some of the grain had been stored for too long and had become old and moldy. The country had once decreed that no one was allowed to move the grain reserves without permission. This was to prevent the lack of grain reserves in the years of disaster to provide relief to the common people. This was originally a good thing, but even though there was no famine in the Taiyuan area, the price of grain was not cheap. The price of grain among the people was high, but there was a large amount of grain stored in the treasury. They could only watch helplessly as the grain spoiled because it had been stored for too long. This was the result of the local rigid implementation of the court's decree. They failed to understand the emperor's love for the people, and at the same time caused unnecessary losses. Therefore, they hoped that the court could allow the local areas to produce grain to stabilize the price of grain. Su Yugong also mentioned in the memorial that there were tens of thousands of ships in the Taiyuan area, and the transportation was convenient. They could buy surplus grain from other places at any time and store it. In this way, the imperial court could sell old rice to the people at a cheaper price, and then buy new rice at a higher price to store it. The price difference between the sale and purchase was not very large for the imperial court, but it could take into account the strategic needs of the country's reserves, extend the storage time of the grain reserves, and benefit the ordinary people who could not afford the high-priced grain. Su Yogong's memorial was written in great detail, and it was reasonable and clear. Wu Zetian listened and was very moved. After careful consideration, she ordered, "Yes, it can be implemented. But first, the Ministry of Revenue must send people to investigate and draw up a plan. No matter what, the grain reserves must be sufficient. If possible, we must first contact the grain source and confirm that new grain can be stored as soon as possible before we can sell old grain." Wu Zetian was in Chang, and at the time of the great disaster that Teneno had experienced when he was young, and she had also experienced it. Although the imperial court was not without food at that time, the various supplies were sharply reduced. She had also heard about everything that had happened in the outside world. After that, the emperor visited the eastern capital, Luoyang, several times, mainly because of grain. Because of the great drought in the Guangzhou area, the grain production decreased, and the lack of storage, the emperor could only lead the court officials to move east to Luoyang to find food. Fortunately, at that time, the Tang dynasty had not been established for long, and the people had already experienced many years of war. They knew that this was caused by the natural disaster and not by the inhumanity of the government. At that time, the families of the rich and powerful also did not have any grain reserves. They revolted and did not have enough to eat, so they could only make the situation of the starving people even worse. But as a ruler, Wu Zetian deeply understood the power of the natural disaster and the importance of storage. On this point, she did not dare to be careless. Now that she was old, and at the important moment of handing over power, she hoped that the transition could be smooth and no accidents would happen. Wan smiled slightly and nodded in agreement. Then there were a few more memorials that talked about grain prices in the north. Since last year, because of the war in the north, the local output was insufficient. The cost of transferring grain from other places was too high, so grain prices had been high. The people were suffering, and they asked the imperial court to open up grain reserves to stabilize prices. There were also memorials that first praised the abundance of the treasury, and then raised the issue of the hamster, embezzlement, and poor safekeeping. Wu Zetian knew of Su Yogong's prestige and power in the imperial censor. He wanted his memorials to be valued by the emperor and to be carried out. He would certainly contact his good friends and support each other. However, these good friends of the imperial censor would not speak nonsense without reason. Since they all raised this issue, it could largely verify the truth of Su Yogong's words. Wu Zetian made her decision and said to Wan, Taiyuan Granary is the largest granary in the north. The grain situation in the north is like this. If we follow Su Yogong's words, we can solve this problem in the shortest time possible. The Ministry of Revenue is afraid that it will take a long time to send people to investigate. So give the edict, order Su Yugong to cooperate with Taiyuan Prefecture to handle this matter. The Ministry of Revenue will prepare this autumn's new grain for storage. The emperor made the final decision, and the reply was quickly passed down. When the edict reached Taiyuan Prefecture and Su Yogong's hands, Shinmu also received the news. As expected, he plans to start with grain. An elegant middle-aged scribes sneered repeatedly. When Shenmu first led a group of people to conquer the world, he completely relied on his intelligence and wisdom. But as time went on and the number of people increased, he didn't have 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. It was impossible for him to have enough energy to analyze and understand all the problems and handle all the matters. Hence, he gradually had a group of wise advisors. However, due to the hidden sex status, he didn't have anyone who had been an official as an advisor. He had been an official before, and even if he didn't have any authority, his status would still be there. Not just anyone could recruit him to be an advisor. This middle-aged scribe was called Zhang Rumin, and he was just an unsuccessful county official. However, to be able to be recruited by Shinmu, he naturally had some capabilities. Shinmu knitted his brows slightly, and his usual carefree attitude was nowhere to be seen. He was very clear that the only loophole that they couldn't plug in time was the grain. Yang Fan chose the grain as the breakthrough point and hit his only Achilles heel. How many gaps do we have in Taiyuan Granary? Shinmu thought for a moment and asked a subordinate who looked like an accountant. That person had a stack of account books in front of him, but he didn't even flip through them. He opened his mouth and said, "There is still a gap of 200,000 dawn that hasn't been filled." Shenmu said resolutely, "Immediately think of a way to fill in the gap. If it really isn't enough, use the grain that was prepared to be transported to Wushile." Zhang Rumin said, "Young master, there are 1,000,000 grains in Taiyuan Granary. They might not be able to find out. Furthermore, this subordinate suspects that Yang Fan has been preparing for a long time. Is this all there is to it? I'm afraid he is purposely beating the grass to startle the snake. In reality, he is making a feint in the east and attacking in the west. He wants us to be at a disadvantage. If we use this batch of reserve grain and he has a backup plan, we will definitely be in a passive position." Shen Mu nodded and praised. "Brother Zhang is right. I have also thought of this point." However, did Brother Zhang think that his method might not be a feint in the east and attack in the west, but a feint in the real situation? Zhang Rumin's expression changed. "Young master is saying," Shinmu said solemnly, "based on my understanding of him, it is very likely that this is his true goal. Perhaps Taiyuan Granary is just a feint, but if we bide our time, then this feint might become a real stab. Furthermore, we have indeed done something to Taiyuan Granary. It is hard to guarantee that he won't find out anything." Zhang Rumin's expression tightened. "Then, can we only be led by the nose by him?" Shinmu revealed a slightly bitter smile and said, "Who asked this to be our weakness? Since he has attacked, we have to guard against him. Right now, we can only react accordingly." As Shinmu said this, his eyes faintly flickered. Master Zhang had followed him for a long time. From the look in his eyes, he could tell that the sect master must have other plans. However, he had no way of knowing what the sect master was thinking about. He could not say, nor could he ask, so he nodded his head and said, "Young master, rest assured. This subordinate will personally go and make Taiyuan granary invulnerable." On a certain day, half a month after the imperial court's order to investigate Taiyuan granary storage and remove the accumulated grain, Pai Erding, the director of the Ministry of Justice, submitted a secret memorial. The secret memorial mentioned that there were some discrepancies between Danzhou and Fuzhou's grain storage and the Ministry of Revenue's report. The Ministry of Justice was only responsible for reviewing the data, so the memorial requested the emperor to send someone to investigate. The speaker, Cui Yuanzong, was known as Bodhisattva Cui when he was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice. He had 4 vajra under his command, difficult to write Sun Yuxuan, treading sweet potatoes Yen Xiaojun, gentle blade Qin Dong, and big axe chopping window Pai Erding. After Yang Fan went to the Ministry of Justice, he fought openly and secretly with these 4 Jianghu masters. However, no discord, no concord. After gaining the title of Plague Doctor, he became friends with them. This memorial was submitted by Yang Fan's good friend, Pai Erding. Grain had a very important place in Wu Zetian's heart, but this did not mean that she would listen to the wind and rain, or that she would fly into a rage at any time. Sometimes there were errors in the audit, and sometimes there was a time difference between when the grain left the granary, when it entered the granary, and when it entered the accounts. There was a discrepancy, but it did not mean that there was a problem. Therefore, Wu Zetian did not make a fuss. However, since there was a discrepancy, she had to find out the truth. Wu Zetian thought for a moment and said, "Have the imperial censorate send people to Danzhou and Fuzhou to investigate the reason for the grain storage." Yes. Wan picked up her pen and wrote another line on Pai Erding's memorial. She added, "Have the imperial censorate investigate." The tip of her pen drew a circle on the memorial. Chapter 894. The imperial censorate sent 2 censors to Danzhou and Feng Prefecture to check on the grain storage. The censor sent to Danzhou was named Shiyu, a jinshi in the first year of Changshou. The censor had a reputation as a virtuous man who was smart and capable. Ever since he was transferred to the imperial censorate, he had been inspecting the country and had impeached many provincial officials, including local officials with powerful backgrounds. Although the imperial censor had the power to make reports, he had to rely on solid evidence when handling cases. Whenever he reported a case, the evidence was irrefutable and no one could refute it. For a time his name was known throughout the capital, and he became a new member of the imperial censorate. This censor was currently on patrol in Jiangzhou. If they sent him to Danzhou, the distance would be very short. It would save the court the trouble of sending another censor on a long journey, and it would also save a lot of time. As for the provincial governor sent to Feng Prefecture, it was Hu Yuanli, the censor who had gone to the southern border with Yang Fan and went through fire and water with him. Being sent to the capital on official business in the middle of summer was definitely a tough job. Hu Yuanli sat in the carriage with the servants, guards, and guards of honor, all listlessly leaving the city's west gate. Most of the officials in the capital were more prestigious than the local officials. But where the emperor was, not many officials were qualified to go out with guards of honor. Usually, they just hung an official banner on the carriage to show their status. But the local officials were different. Once they went out, they would be surrounded by guards of honor and show off their authority. Because of this, when the officials of the capital left the capital, it was the same. As soon as they left the capital, the ceremonial procession would begin. Placards of silence, placards of retreat, placards of official titles were raised high, flags, spears, water, and fire cudgels were all present, but there were no gongs to open the way. Gongs opening the way originated from the Qing dynasty. At this time, it was still the servants leading the guards of honor who shouted to open the way, but they did not have many opportunities to shout. Unless they were blind, who could not see the appearance of the guards of honor, The weather was so hot that it seemed to be on fire. It was almost autumn, but the heat did not lessen at all. They walked on the straight official road without any cover. Because it was close to the capital for safety reasons, there was not a single tree on either side of the road. So there was no place to hide even if they wanted to. The ground seemed to have been melted by the sun. Even the dust stirred up by the horses' hooves was weak. After walking for only a few miles, the entourage's clothes were already soaked in sweat. Hu Yuanli sat in the carriage with the curtains drawn up high. He kept waving the fan in his hand, but he still felt unbearably hot. Finally, they saw the shade of a tree in front of them. Everyone was delighted. The convoy naturally deviated from the main road and drove under the shade of the road. Ah, I was wondering who had left the capital. Turns out it's Imperial Messenger Hu. Haha, brother Hu, it's been a long time. Suddenly, someone on the side of the road spoke loudly. Hu Yuanli turned his head and couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise. He quickly ordered, "Stop the car!" Standing by the roadside was a man with a green headscarf on his head, wearing a short shirt with narrow sleeves, rolled-up cloth pants, barefooted, looking like a farmer working in the fields, but he was very handsome. His body did not look very sturdy, but he did not look thin or weak either. His eyes were full of spirit, with a hidden glimmer of precious light. That unruly appearance did not resemble a farmer at all. He was none other than the loyal general of the imperial court, Yang Fan. Hu Yuanli quickly got off the carriage and went forward to pay his respects, saying, "Greetings to the loyal general." Yang Fan helped him up and said with a smile, "Brother Hu, are you treating me like an outsider?" "We are brothers. There's no need for so many unnecessary formalities." Hu Yuanli laughed and stood still. He asked, "Why is Erling here?" Yang Fan said with a smile, "Taking a break from my busy schedule, I came to this lake with my family." As Yang Fan said this, he pointed to the side. Hu Yuanli looked over and saw that behind the roadside there were layers of green lotus leaves stacked on top of each other, reaching far into the horizon. He did not know how many hectares it was. Among the dark green leaves, there were lotus arrows leaping out one after another, like a brush dipped in rouge, so much so that the color would not fade away. In the depths of the blue lake, there were several small boats with sheds, floating among the green lotus flowers. There were women and children on the boats, but they could not be seen clearly from afar. Presumably, they were Yang Fan's family. Hu Yuanli could not help but say with an envious smile, "Erling is really free. I can't compare to you." Yang Fan laughed and walked to the lakeside. He plucked 2 big wheel-like leaves and spread them on the grass. He said to Hu Yuanli, "Long time no see. Please sit for a while. I won't disturb brother Hu's journey." Hu Yuanli smiled slightly and turned his head to order, "All of you rest." Finishing, he walked over and lifted his robe to sit on the lotus leaves. The servants were overjoyed, but they did not dare to disturb their superior. One by one, they dispersed to the distant lakeside to wash their faces and cool off. Yang Fan asked with a smile, "Where is brother Hu going?" Hu Yuanli frowned and sighed, It's a hard job. The Ministry of Revenue has found some discrepancies in the grain reserves of a certain area in Guangzhou. The court has sent me to investigate." Yang Fan suddenly said, So brother Hu is here for this matter. Then brother Hu must be going to either Danzhou or Fengzhou." Hu Yuanli originally thought this was an ordinary mistake. It was not as if similar things had not happened before. After investigating, it was mostly a problem with the efficiency of the local authorities. Some of the grain entered the warehouse had not been entered into the accounts. Some had not been entered into the accounts, and it was the same for the exit. When these 2 factors were added together, there was a relatively large discrepancy. Upon closer inspection, it was only the efficiency of each link that had a problem, but there was actually no problem with the grain amount. The law did not punish the masses, so it was not good to investigate further. In the end, the matter was left unsettled. Therefore, he had no interest in this trip at all. But now that Yang Fan had blurted out his destination, Hu Yuanli's heart was moved. Yang Fan was a member of the 1,000 Cavalry, and the ears and eyes of the palace were extremely well informed. This matter had nothing to do with the military, but Yang Fan could blurt out his destination. Was there some reason behind this that outsiders could not know? Hu Yuanli's spirits rose. He hurriedly caught on to what Yang Fan had revealed and asked with a smile, "How did Erlang know my destination? Is there some inside story that outsiders cannot know? You and I are brothers, not outsiders. Erlang, please give me your advice." Hu Yuanli's ceremonial procession began once again, and he headed west in an awe-inspiring manner against the scorching sun. The weather was still hot and stuffy, but Hu Yuanli sat in the carriage and forgot to wave his fan. He had heard some news from Yang Fan, which made him pay extra attention to this trip to Feng Province, which he did not attach much importance to before. It seemed that there really was a problem with the grain storage in Feng Province and Danzhou. The Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Revenue each had their own version of events. The emperor could not be sure if there really was a problem with the local grain storage, so he ordered the censorate to investigate. The emperor did not give any special instructions for this mission. Naturally, it was the result of the dispute between the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Revenue. Before he had solid evidence, the emperor could not be partial to the Ministry of Justice. He could not investigate the Ministry of Revenue with great fanfare and see them as thieves. Otherwise, if there was no solid evidence, it would inevitably chill the hearts of the Ministry of Revenue. Thinking of this, Hu Yuanli suddenly became excited. This was a chance. Among the various censors in the censorate, he was inexperienced and had little reputation. Originally, it would have been impossible for him to become an official in the censorate so quickly. However, his last trip to the southern border had become his greatest political asset. Now he was one of the 2 officials with the highest hopes of being promoted to imperial censor. Currently, the right imperial censor position of the censorate was still vacant. There were only 3 people qualified for this position. One was Imperial Censor Shiryu, who had gone to Danzhou to investigate a case. The other was Imperial Censor Li Qingma, and the last was Hu Yuanli. Among the 3, Li Qingma was the most senior. However, other than this advantage, he was inferior to Meng Qi and Shiryu in other aspects. His political achievements were really nothing to write home about. In terms of political achievements, his greatest achievement was the last time he and Yang Fan toured the southern provinces and quelled the rebellion. However, that had been some time ago. During this time, it was Imperial Censor Shiryu who had risen to fame. What were the political achievements of the Imperial Censor? It was not to pacify the people, control the government, or manage the army. It was not about money and grain. It all depended on how many corrupt officials and servants he had gotten rid of and how many major cases he had solved for the country. If there was really a problem in Danzhou when the capital was still in Chang, and the food supply for millions of people had been continuously supplied during the years of disasters. Under the circumstances of transportation difficulties, the emperor had once decreed that scholars were forbidden to go to the capital to take the imperial examinations to avoid increasing the food burden. The emperor had also moved to Luoyang several times and was jokingly called the grain-chasing emperor. Therefore, Hu Yuanli was very clear about His Majesty's attitude toward grain. If there was really a problem with the grain, if there was really a problem, Hu Yuanli's eyes slowly narrowed. An indescribable excitement surged in his chest. He seemed to see the official hat of the imperial censor waving at him enthusiastically. Rumble! The sound of rolling thunder came from afar. Hu Yuanli subconsciously looked up and saw dark clouds slowly approaching. It seemed that there would be a heavy rain soon. Hu Yuanli frowned. It was difficult to walk under the scorching sun, but it was also difficult to walk under the pouring rain. Thinking of the grain storage case in Danzhou, Hu Yuanli couldn't help but feel a haze in his heart. Is God telling me something? It seems that I have to plan carefully. On Yang Fan's side, the sun was still shining brightly. Xiao Man sat at the bow of the boat with Si Rong in her arms. The boat lady held the bamboo pole, and the sharp tip of the boat squeezed through layers of green leaves and rode to the shore. The red lotus petals were like the rosy clouds, reflecting the picturesque Xiao Man and her beautiful daughter. The daughter was playing in the water for fun and was having a good time. "Father!" Si Rong giggled, trying her best to stretch her small hand out of her mother's bosom, grabbing the clear water in the lake. The water flowed past her delicate fingertips, like a white jade comb, combing countless extremely fine green silk ribbons. This scene was vaguely familiar. Yang Fan suddenly thought of Chang, and Tsuchi, the head of Hibiscus Bridge, the cluster of green lotuses, and of that indescribably beautiful and graceful young lady, who was like the first tilt of a lotus lid. The news of the battle with the hidden sect has been sent to Chang. With Miss Ning Ke's wisdom, she should be able to deal with it easily. Yang Fan thought and smiled slightly. He admired Miss Ning Ke's extraordinary wisdom. Although his decision was given to Duguyu, he knew that Miss Ning Ke wouldn't just sit by and watch. As long as Miss Ning Ke took action, even if they couldn't win, at least they could stabilize the situation in Chang. And rumble! The faint sound of thunder reached his ears. Yang Fan looked up and saw a line of dark clouds in the sky. Yang Fan bent down and plucked a lotus flower. He threw it to the bow of the boat, and it hit his daughter's head. Si Rong exclaimed, hugged the lotus flower, and laughed. Yang Fan smiled and said, "Good daughter, don't be naughty. Let's go home quickly. It's going to rain." Chapter 895. In a tall building that was dark, cool, and emitting a musty and sweaty smell, moldy and dirty mats were spread out. There was a short table on each mat. Originally, a group of people were gathered around the short table, shouting and yelling as they played gambling games such as Six Gambles, Cattail, Double Continent, and so on. At this moment, the gamblers at each table ran to the table near the door and surrounded it, watching the two people's magnificent gambling feat. The two of them used the simplest method of gambling: dice toss. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. There was a small white porcelain bowl and 3 wooden dice in the shape of a hexagon. From 1 to 6, they were painted black dots. They were like the eyes of the devil, spinning and staring at the gamblers in a seductive manner. With the crazy roar of the crowd, the dice did not disappoint. 6. The gambler sitting on the left side of the short table was thin, with a sharp chin, 2 mustaches, and a face full of pockmarks. He was calmly holding the dice and smiling at the person opposite him. The person opposite him was not tall, fat, and his fat face was covered with greasy sweat. His eyes were wide open, and he was breathing rapidly, constantly wiping the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The mustache youth smiled and said, "You lost. Your house is now mine." This casino was converted from an abandoned granary. There was a curtain with a picture of a pie show hanging at the door, which was the casino's signboard. Because of the hot summer, the granary was very cool. So since the beginning of summer, the casino had a lot of customers. The fat man who had just lost his house was called Ku Zhao, and he was a pawn of the Feng Zhou granary. The pawn was a small official with no rank, but the person in charge of the granary had a lot of power in the eyes of the commoners. In addition, this casino originally belonged to the Feng Zhou granary, and Ku Zhao, who was addicted to gambling, hung out here every day, so everyone here knew him. "How is it, Brother Ku? You don't seem to have the capital to gamble anymore, right?" The rat-bearded young man had a nasty smile on his face as he looked at Ku Zhao. The 3 dice were spinning nimbly between his fingers. Fatty clenched his teeth and slammed the table and shouted, "I'll put my wife on the line." The rat-bearded young man curled his lips in disdain and said, "The one who brought you lunch just now? You've already lost your money and house to me. Isn't it easy for me to get a wife? I really don't like your wife's appearance." One of the surrounding gamblers said, "How good can your face be?" Someone else said, "Foreigner, don't be too arrogant. Where it is possible to let people off, One should spare them. The rat-bearded young man said with a smile, "This is a casino. If you're willing to bet, you must be willing to accept your loss. It doesn't matter if you're a foreigner or a native. How do you want me to forgive you? Oh, I remember you. A few days ago, I gambled with you and lost 4 strings of money to you. Now I'm asking you to spit out the money. Will you do it?" The man didn't speak after hearing that. Because of the geographical relationship, the locals would always side with the locals. However, this rule didn't seem to work in the casino. There were no fathers and sons in the casino, let alone the villagers. The rat-bearded youth glanced at Fatty Coo and said, "What? If you still can't take out your capital, I'm leaving." Fatty Coo slammed the table again and roared, I'll give my daughter to you as well." The rat-bearded youth's eyes lit up and said, "Your daughter? How old is she?" Fatty Coo stuttered and said, 2 years old. The rat-bearded youth was greatly discouraged and shook his head. "No, you don't have any capital? Then let's go and collect the house." He stood up and was about to leave when Fatty Coo pulled him back. The rat-bearded youth stared at him and said, "What? Are you still going to go back on your word?" Fatty Coo's face turned red and said, "Let's bet again. I'll write you an IOU. I'm the manager of Peng Zhou's warehouse. Everyone here knows me. If I lose again, I won't be able to repay your debt. It's going to be autumn soon. It won't take long for me to repay your debt." The rat-bearded youth hesitated for a moment and reluctantly sat down. The 2 of them started gambling again. After a while, the rat-bearded youth laughed and left. Fatty Coo's face was as pale as paper. He sat there motionless like a clay sculpture. The rat-bearded youth swaggered back to his rented courtyard and returned to his room. He closed the door. There was a pottery basin filled with water on the wooden shelf facing the wall. The rat-bearded youth bent over to wash his face. Soon, the pockmarks on his face disappeared and his yellowish skin became white and tender. When he straightened his back, his willowy eyebrows, almond-shaped eyes, greasy nose, and cherry lips astonishingly turned into a big beauty with bright eyes and white teeth. An extremely strong man yawned and came out of the inner room. He had just stretched his waist when he saw her and couldn't help but smile. "Zhuyun is back." The beauty looked back and smiled. "Big brother, my matter is settled. The rest is up to you." Si Rong and Nian Zhu were not afraid of the heat. They were playing happily on the lake. When they heard that their father wanted them to go back to the city, Si Rong was better. But Nian Zhu couldn't help crying and acting coquettishly, hoping to change his father's mind. As a result, Yang Fan was not moved by his crying at all. He was a strict father, and he also spoiled him like his mother. Nian Zhu had no choice but to lie in the carriage and play with a few small fish caught from the lake. There was a green jar which was half filled with lake water. A few small fish were swimming happily. Nian Zhu reached out to catch the fish and played with it a few times. He laughed, and the tears on his face had not yet dried. Yang Fan and Xiao Man looked at each other and shook their heads in amusement. Ka, la la. A deafening sound of thunder seemed to ring above their heads. Si Rong, who was tired from playing, woke up with a start. Xiao Man quickly patted her head and coaxed, "Nan be good. Sleep well." Si Rong closed her eyes again in a daze. The rain came down. Bean-sized raindrops pattered down and hit the roof of the carriage. There was a commotion outside the carriage. The attendants put on their straw raincoats. The common people who were hurrying on the official road ran under the trees to shelter from the rain. There were also those with rain gear who hurriedly held up umbrellas and put on straw raincoats. A man in black, riding a donkey and wearing a straw raincoat, hurried past the carriage of Yang Fan's family in the rain. The rain was very heavy. In just a moment, the raindrops formed a line. The world was a vast expanse of white. The man in black, riding the donkey, was in a sorry state in the rain. When he reached a place where weeds, reeds, and shrubs were flourishing, He suddenly looked back and hurriedly pulled the reins, driving the donkey into the reeds. Two people suddenly emerged from the reeds. They parted the reeds to the left and right to let the man in black riding the donkey pass. They then let go of their hands, and the reeds returned to normal. The two figures behind the reeds fell down and disappeared. The torrential rain poured down without warning. Who would have thought that a moment ago the sun was burning like fire, and a moment later it would be pouring rain? Although Ding Lauscher, who was driving the carriage for Yang Fan, was wearing a straw raincoat, he was also drenched. He could barely open his eyes. Fortunately, this was a straight official road. Even if he closed his eyes, he could still drive. At first, when the rain fell, dust flew everywhere, and there was a pungent smell of soil in the air. Now, there was only a clear and cool water vapor. In the heat of summer, it was actually quite good to have a little rain to cool down the temperature. If one were to stand under the porch and watch the rain fall like a curtain, and listen to the sound of the rain falling into the lotus vats, it would be quite an artistic experience. But standing in the rain, the feeling was completely different. Puddles of rainwater quickly formed on the ground. The wheels of the carriage passed by, and the rainwater splashed high into the air. It was probably because there were 4 people sitting in the carriage, and the materials used to make the carriage seemed very exquisite. The curtains of the carriage had already been drawn down to prevent the rain from entering the carriage. There were a few riders in front of the carriage. The rider on the horse squinted his eyes and shouted, "Hurry up, we'll enter the city in a few more li." His voice didn't travel too far amidst the sounds of the rain, but the carriages nearby heard him. Ding Lauscher immediately raised his whip and urged his horse to speed up. When the carriages behind him saw the one in front speeding up, they naturally followed suit as well. Large patches of shrubs and reeds gradually appeared on both sides of the road. In the reeds, there were 2 people lying in ambush. They were draped in rain silk, which could barely shelter them from the wind and rain. The rainwater hit the reeds around them, making rustling sounds, but when it hit their bodies, there was a continuous thud sound. This rain really came at a bad time. One of them forcefully wiped the rainwater off his face and said softly, "The 2 people lying here were the 2 most skilled martial artists of the hidden sect in Luoyang. The one who spoke was called Yi Xiaoyu, and the one beside him was called Lung Aoyu." Lung Aoyu said, "Fortunately, it doesn't affect our plan much. When the rain comes, pedestrians will avoid it, and there will be fewer people on the main road. If someone sees them, when the rain washes away, there won't even be any hoof prints left. It will be even harder for the authorities to find their whereabouts." Yi Xiaoyu let out a breath and said, "Will Lord Zhao's move work? We didn't report to young master to get his approval." Lung Aoyu said, "Why not?" "Lord Zhao said that this is called taking drastic measures. As long as we take down that Yang fellow, the hidden sect will be without a leader and will be in chaos. It's coming." Before Yi Xiaoyu could finish his sentence, Lung Aoyu subconsciously lowered his body. His chest was immersed in the rapidly overflowing water, and his chest felt cool. "Prepare to move." Yi Xiaoyu's eyes flashed with radiance, and he also lowered his body while his hand slowly moved to the back of his waist. On his waist, there was a cloth belt that was twisted into a rope, and on the cloth belt, there was a long whip that had a handle made of cow bones. The whip was coiled around the handle, and the whip was made of cow skin that had been soaked in the rainwater until it was glossy. "Move." When the first chariot neared the encirclement, Yi Xiaoyu let out a loud roar and stood up. He shook his arm in midair, and a black whip appeared in his palm. It was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed across the sky, and it swept towards Ding Lauscher, who was driving the chariot. Lung Aoyu was like a ferocious tiger that came out of the mountains, and he scuttled out of the reeds with a swish. The whip was like a spirit snake, and it suddenly wrapped around the carriage driver's body. Yi Xiaoyu forcefully swung it, and Ding Lauscher was swept horizontally to the front. The 2 horsemen who had heard the warning fell off their horses, and they fell into the rain with a bang, splashing water everywhere. At the same time, Lung Aoyu's 8 steps chasing cicada was as fast as the wind, and with a few leaps he had already pounced in front of the first carriage. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Chapter 896. The coachman fell off his horse, and so did the knights in front. The 2 horses that were pulling the carriage lost their master's command and stopped abruptly. They shook off the rainwater on their manes and snorted. When the man in green riding the donkey came over, he had already seen clearly that the first carriage was occupied by Yang Fan and his wife. Their 2 children were also in the carriage. The second carriage was occupied by Yang Fan's wife, Tin Ano. They also knew that Yang Fan and his wife, as well as Madame Ru, were all skilled in martial arts. According to their plan, they would first sweep the coachman off his horse and hinder the knights from rushing to the rescue. Then they would quickly approach the carriage. At the same time, the other accomplices lying in ambush would restrain Yang Fan's entourage and Tin Ano. It would be best if they could take her down. Even if they could not, it would be fine as long as they could prevent her from rushing to the rescue. It was said that although Yang Fan's wife was skilled in martial arts, she was already pregnant, so she would not be much of a threat. The 2 of them had the highest martial arts, so they were responsible for restraining Yang Fan, his wife, and their children. There were 2 more people on the opposite side of the road who were responsible for supporting them. Although Yang Fan and his wife were skilled in martial arts, they were in such a small space with their children. They would not be able to use their skills to their full potential. Master Zhao had already instructed that it would be best if they could capture him alive. If not, they could take his life. It would be more difficult to capture Yang Fan directly. If they could control his children, it would be no different from capturing him directly. When the 2 of them leaped into the air, they expected that their accomplices would follow suit and intercept Yang Fan's guards, servants, and the 2 carriages in front and behind him. However, it seemed that the heavy rain had affected their coordination. Yi Xiaoyou's shout did not have the desired effect. When Ding Laoshi was thrown into the air and the 2 guards were swept off their horses, the other ambushers on both sides of the road did not appear. Lung Aoyu had no time to think. He rushed to the side of the carriage in a few strides and punched the carriage with both his fists. He was well trained in martial arts and wore iron gloves on his hands. With one punch, the car made of hardwood would immediately break into pieces. Unexpectedly, when his fist landed, there was only a kung sound. Lung Aoyu seemed to have suffered a huge shock, and he took 3 steps back. His wrist was in pain, but the car only shook slightly and there was not even a crack on it. How could this be? Lung Aoyu turned pale with fright, but he immediately reacted. This carriage must be made of iron. He didn't have time to think too much, and immediately leaped into the air, fiercely punching the window again. With a loud clang, the bamboo curtain hanging from the window was shattered by his fist, and rain fell down. Surprisingly, there was also a piece of iron plate inside. It was just that the iron plate covering the window was obviously not as thick as the iron plate covering the body of the car, and a slight dent was left behind by his punch. However, how powerful was Lung Aoyu's iron fists? This all-out attack only left a dent on the iron plate. The thickness of the iron plate was enough to defend against any attack from any weapon in this era. Perhaps even a big iron hammer used to break a city would need 2 or 3 hits to break the window. Almost at the same time, Yi Xiaoyu rushed to the shaft of the carriage and reached out to pull the door. Lung Aoyu reacted quickly and immediately shouted, "Not good! We've fallen into a trap." What? Yi Xiaoyu's hand had already gripped the door tightly. He pulled hard, but it didn't move at all. When he heard Lung Aoyu's shout, he was stunned. He wanted to turn over and jump off the shaft of the carriage, but a large net had already opened above his head and quickly fell on him. Yi Xiaoyu jumped and rushed out. An entire net wrapped around his body. Before he could release his body, he fell head first into the rain, rolled a few times, and rolled into the roadside drainage ditch. Lung Aoyu made a prompt decision, turned around, and fled. He used the 8 steps chasing cicada technique and ran as fast as he could. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. With 3 strides, Lung Aoyu arrived at the edge of the reed pond like a ghost. He leaned his body forward and leaped with all his might, leaping into the reed thicket like an arrow. As long as he escaped into the reed pond, not to mention an ambush, even an army wouldn't be able to catch him. At this moment, someone in the distance suddenly threw a short stick with 2 small round balls tied to its 2 ends. As soon as it touched his ankle, the straight stick suddenly bent like a snake. It turned out that it was actually a rope with 2 heavy ball-shaped objects tied to its 2 ends. It firmly tied his 2 legs together. The person who threw the rope raised his head slightly. Under the straw raincoat, his eyebrows were as thick as ink, and his face was square. It was the Gu family's old man. Lung Aoyu was in the middle of running when his legs were suddenly tied up. With an awe sound, he fell forward. Not good. Lung Aoyu hurriedly stretched out his hands to support himself, but before his hands touched the ground, a big foot suddenly appeared in front of him. With a puff sound, Lung Aoyu's vision turned black, and he fell heavily to the ground, a fishy taste in his mouth and nose. 2 burly men rushed out of the reed bush, shook open a cloth bag, and neatly put Lung Aoyu inside and dragged him away. In the rain, a line of water was plowed on the ground. The window slowly rose, and Yang Fan and Xiao Man slowly let go of the palms that were covering their children's ears and looked outside calmly. Yang Yanzu's eyes widened, and his face was full of excitement, his little butt arched, wanting to jump out to watch the show. It seemed that he treated this as a fun game. Yang Fan thought to himself, although there is silk cotton in the carriage, this window does not have the effect of reducing the sound, and it is too ear-piercing when it is hit. I should get the Ghost Axe Division to improve it later. The convoy continued to move forward in the rain, as if nothing had happened. Yi Xiaoyu, who was covered in mud and rain, was tightly wrapped in a fish net like a loach, and was thrown into the 3rd carriage, unable to struggle. The carriage was filled with cloth curtains, a few tables, cooking utensils, cups, and plates. These were all things that Yang Fan had brought with him on today's trip. Lung Aoyu was lying next to him, with only his feet sticking out of the sack. At first, Lung Aoyu struggled a little, but after a heavy blow to the head from the guard, he stopped moving. It was unknown whether he was knocked unconscious or a wise man who knew what was good for him. The convoy continued to move forward for about 1.5 miles, and then turned into a side road which led to Niu village. Old butler Niu's family was in Niu village. His eldest son farmed, his second son farmed, and his old man worked as a butler in the Yang family. They were considered a wealthy family in the village. At this time, the vegetable garden of Niu Er's family had become Yang Fan's torture hall. The rain was still falling, drenching the vegetable leaves green and shiny, appearing abnormally fresh and verdant. The backyard of the Niu family was connected to the eaves of the roof, which must be a place for the family to cool off in summer. The rain hit the wooden roof, making a plop sound like boiling water falling to the ground. Xiao Man and Nu stayed in the front yard with their children. This was the advantage of rural people. Although the house was dilapidated, the yard was very big. There were a few rooms in the front yard for the children and grandchildren, and the row of rooms in the back belonged to Niu Erliang and his wife. Niu Er was now almost 40 years old, and he was already a grandfather of 4 children. There were chickens, ducks, and geese in the Niu family's yard. Yang Yanzu and his sister, Si Rong, didn't often see these things in the mansion. They usually saw poultry and meat cooked and served on the table, so Yang Yanzu was very happy. He held a broken ladle in his hand, filled with some shriveled grains, and happily fed the chickens under the eaves in the rain. Yang Fan came to the shed in the backyard with Ren Wei and several other bodyguards. He sat down on a bench and saw the one-armed old man Gu standing respectfully to the side. He said politely, "Old man Gu, please sit." Old man Gu hurriedly said with a smile, "This old man is used to standing. Ah Lang can sit." As he said this, he sighed softly in his heart. ever since he knew that he had been happy for nothing, and that the respected head of the illustrious clan didn't like his daughter. The old man had been depressed for a long time. Yang Fan stared blankly at the vegetables that looked even more fresh and juicy after being watered by the rain for a while. He sighed softly and said, "Bring them here." Yi Xiaoyu and Leng Aoyu were dragged over with their hands tied behind their backs. The one who tied people up was an expert. Their arms were tied tightly, so there was no way they could break free. The two were brought in front of Yang Fan and pressed to the ground, but they didn't want to kneel down. Yang Fan's bodyguards were just about to take action, but Yang Fan waved his hand and asked them to step back. He looked at the two and said lightly, "Uncivilized people are just uncivilized people. They only know how to use the tricks of Jianghu people." Yi Xiaoyu heard the disdain in his words, so he puffed out his chest and said loudly, "Don't be too proud. We are here under Master Zhao's order. Young Master Shin doesn't know about it. Humph. If we really want to use the people around young Master, even if you hide yourself in a turtle shell, you may not be able to keep your life." Yang Fan frowned slightly and said, "Master Zhao? Zhao Yu? Hee. It's rare that he has a few capable people around him." Zhao Yu had come to Luoyang under Shin Mu's order to develop. He had once been very close to Yang Fan. Afterward, when Yang Fan became the overlord of the hidden sect, Zhao Yu had disappeared without a trace. Yang Fan had once sent people to look for him, but there were no traces of him in the few hidden sect locations that he knew of. Yang Fan knew that after he became the overlord of the hidden sect, he would naturally become a competitor of the hidden sect. Zhao Yu would definitely be on guard against him, and the few hidden sect locations that he knew of would definitely be changed. Thus, he gave up on trying to contact Zhao Yu. In fact, Yang Fan just wanted to understand Shin Mu's situation in Xinluo through Zhao Yu. Yang Fan was already suspicious. Why would Shin Mu come up with such a bad plan? It was simple and crude, but it wouldn't affect the overall situation. It wasn't something that a wise person would do. Now that he had confirmed that it wasn't Shin Mu's idea, Yang Fan's slightly furrowed brows slowly relaxed. Although Yang Fan wasn't afraid of the hidden sect's provocation and knew that there would definitely be a battle between the two parties, he hoped that it would be a battle between the two parties' combined strength. They weren't an army, and if they were to assassinate the other party's leader with brute force, it wouldn't affect the overall situation. Just like the hidden sect's young Master Jiang. When young Master Jiang collapsed, the 7 sects and 5 families immediately pushed him up, and the hidden sect's strength wasn't affected at all. It was the same for the hidden sect. The hidden sect might have relied on Shen Mu's individual ability to stand out step by step and develop from a small organization that was subordinate to the hidden sect to a stage where they could compete with the hidden sect. But it was still under the control of the old foxes of the 7 sects and 5 families. If Shen Mu died, the 7 sects and 5 families could elect another representative at any time. That person wouldn't have Shen Mu's prestige and control over the hidden sect, and that person might be more suitable for those old foxes. Therefore, even if they were to become opponents, Yang Fan didn't wish for Shen Mu to be blinded by greed. He wasn't willing to see Shen Mu being so cold-blooded towards himself. Now that he heard that this action wasn't considered brilliant and that the objective wasn't Shen Mu's idea, Yang Fan suddenly felt indescribably comfortable. Chapter 897. Yang Fan relaxed his brows and pondered for a moment before saying, "Since it was Zhao Yu's idea to assassinate me, then what is Shen Mu's plan?" Yi Xiaoyu glanced at him coldly and said, "I don't know. Our young master's wisdom is as deep as the ocean and is not something we can guess." Yang Fan narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "All right, you don't know what he is planning, but you should know what he has been doing since he returned to the Central Plains in secret, right?" Yi Xiaoyu raised his head and sneered. "Do you think I will tell you?" Leng Aoyu said, "There is nothing that cannot be said. 2 years ago, we fought with the obvious sect and suffered great losses. After returning for a year, young master has been recovering her strength and making up for some of the problems in the past. He did not do anything against the hidden sect. Yang Fan laughed involuntarily and said, "According to what you said, how do you explain your actions today?" Lung Aoyu retorted, "You have to ask yourself. Why did you suddenly move the succession hall to Luoyang? Why did the obvious sex people suddenly start searching for information about us?" Yang Fan mocked, "So, I, Yang, am the one at fault for starting a war?" His eyes swept across the two and said, "Shinmu has been back for a year without any news. As a member of the succession hall, I know nothing about it. Does this count as having no ill intentions?" "That's right. He did not do anything against us during this year. He was just recovering his strength and making up for the loopholes. But what happened after that?" Yang Fan's eyes gradually turned sharp as he said, "After he made up for the loopholes and set up his defenses, what does he intend to do? He is already sharpening his blade, and you blame me for making the first move?" Kiki, Yi Xiaoyu and Lung Aoyu were instantly speechless. Looking at the mocking smile in Yang Fan's eyes, Yi Xiaoyu couldn't help but say, "We are just unconvinced. Why should the hidden sect submit to the obvious sect and listen to your orders?" Yang Fan said, "It seems that after the battle in Chang, and the situation has changed. Right now, doesn't your hidden sect have the same status as us?" Yi Xiaoyu said, "So what? Facts have proven that we are stronger than you. Whatever you can do, we can also do. What you can't do, we can still do. If it wasn't for the fact that your Xian clan had taken the top position in these years, if it was our master, the succession hall wouldn't be like it is today." Yang Fan helplessly shook his head and sighed. That's it. All dissatisfaction was just an excuse. In the end, it was just a battle of interests. You think this way, but the people of Xian sect also think this way. Of course this battle could not be avoided. I believe that even if Shinmu and I don't want to fight, you will create all kinds of conflicts and force us to fight, right? After confirming that this operation was not initiated by Shinmu, and from what these two people said, it was very likely that they only knew about the existence of the succession hall, but did not know that there were 7 sects and 5 families behind the succession hall. Yang Fan suddenly felt dispirited. It was impossible to get any useful information from these two people. Lung Aoyu, who had always been cold and silent, suddenly asked, "Where are our people?" Yang Fan, who was in deep thought, paused for a moment and immediately understood. He replied indifferently, "Them? They are forever left in the reed shrubs." When Yi Xiaoyu heard this, his eyes couldn't help but turn bloodshot as he shouted, "I will kill you!" Unfortunately, just as he was about to pounce, Renwei ruthlessly kicked him in the knee socket, causing him to kneel on the ground with a thud. Lung Aoyu angrily said, "Who betrayed us?" Yang Fan raised his eyes and looked at him with some amusement. Yi Xiaoyu suddenly came to a realization. He gritted his teeth and said, "Who is it? Who betrayed us?" Yang Fan shook his head and said, "No one betrayed you." Yi Xiaoyu angrily said, "T. If no one betrayed us, how did you know that we would be lying in ambush? How did you arrange for an expert to eliminate our people without anyone knowing?" Yang Fan unhurriedly said, "Because young Master Jiang once had an incredible expert under him. That senior's surname was Liu. But even this expert and young Master Jiang had suffered a huge loss in the hands of your hidden sect. When I was fighting with young Master Jiang, I was already facing a formidable enemy. Now that I am facing the two of you who had once made young Master Jiang suffer a huge loss, how can I not be extra careful?" Yi Xiaoyu and Lung Aoyu's faces were ashen, and they couldn't say another word. Jiang Yi didn't have a traitor, but they had suffered a crushing defeat. With such a huge disparity, what else was there to say? To them, who had always been conceited, this outcome was even worse than death. Yang Fan slowly stood up. It was unknown when the rain had stopped, but there were 2 rainbows in the sky. It was a double rainbow, but they weren't parallel. Instead, they were like 2 rainbow bridges that were connected. The rainbow-colored light emitted a blurred beauty. Under the eaves, the rainwater was dripping incessantly, creating new ripples in the puddles that were gradually calming down. Yang Fan brushed his sleeves, turned around and walked into his room. Under the canopy, he left behind his final words. "You didn't have to die, but you shouldn't have had designs on my family." Swish! The snow-white blade light flashed in the air, and the water that flowed to the vegetable field quickly turned blood red. Perhaps the vegetables in this field would grow exceptionally luscious. The rain stopped, and the carriages left the Ox Clan Manor and drove towards Luoyang City. This time, Yang Fan sat in a news carriage. Because the two little fellows were sleepy, they were sleeping soundly on their mother's left and right, occupying all the seats. Anu gently caressed her bulging tummy and asked gently, "You didn't receive any useful information?" Yang Fan nodded and shook his head. "I didn't receive any information, but I did." Anu raised her pretty eyebrows. "Oh," Yang Fan said. "Today's lame assassination attempt, I originally suspected that it wasn't Shenmu's doing. Sure enough, it was Zhao Yu who thought himself clever. Zhao Yu is Shenmu's confidant, but he didn't know what countermeasures Shenmu had against me, so he had no choice but to use this plan to share his master's burden. This means—" Yang Fan glanced at Anu, and Anu suddenly understood. "I understand. This means that Shenmu wasn't lured here by you because Lang Jun moved the succession hall to Luoyang. He didn't regard Luoyang as your main battlefield, so he didn't deploy any troops here." Yang Fan nodded. "Yes, but also wrong. Here, he doesn't have the right time, the right place, or the right people. Of course, he won't be led by the nose by me so easily, but he still had to come here sooner or later because I have the initiative." Yang Fan thought for a while and explained, "He is in Chang, and I am in Luoyang. Both of us have arranged our troops and are in a stalemate, just like two armies facing each other. Under such circumstances, unless one side runs out of provisions or reveals a flaw, or the three armies request a fight, the stalemate will continue. But I am now intercepting his provisions. How can he not come out?" Yang Fan smiled and said resolutely, "Even if he doesn't want to send troops, he has to do it now." In Chang, and Shenmu paced with his hands behind his back with an ugly expression. He said slowly, "Imperial messengers sure went to investigate Danzhou and censor who went to investigate Feng. Yang Fan really has a backup plan." Another advisor under Shenmu, Lan Jinhai, anxiously clutched his wrist and said, "Brother Zhang has already gathered provisions and gone to Taiyuan. How about we immediately send someone to ask him to change his route to Danzhou?" Shenmu shook his head. "It's too late. Yang Fan is really good at planning his second move after half a month. He knows that if I make a move, it will be too late for him to react. Moreover, even if the matter in Danzhou is settled, what about the one in Feng? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. We have been led by the nose by him. We will be defeated sooner or later." Shenmu slowly paced around the room and stopped. He said, "Let's take it step by step. Siyu is about to reach Danzhou, but Hu Yuanli is still on his way. Let's deal with censor sure first. Humph, you have Zhang Liang's plan, and I have a ladder to climb over the wall. We may not lose to you." In the alley, Ku Zhao and Deacon Ku walked dejectedly, wondering who else they could borrow money from. When he gambled with the dice that day, not only did he lose all his family's money, but he also lost his house to someone else. But his father was not dead yet, so he could not make the decision. When he went home and leaked the news, his father picked up his walking stick and chased after him on the street. He was so scared that he did not even dare to return home. His wife was originally an extremely virtuous and docile woman. Because of his addiction to gambling, a good family had long been ruined by him, and she never had any complaints. However, this time he really lost too much. After crying loudly, his wife wanted to hang herself. Fortunately, she was saved by someone. When his wife's family heard the news, a few of his elder brothers-in-law came together and took his wife back to her family. His father was also deeply grieved. He knew that his son was not a good person and had let down his wife. So he asked his father-in-law to find another son-in-law so that he would not be cheated by his scoundrel son. Because of this, a few of his elder brothers-in-law stopped him once and gave him a beating. They only stopped when he wrote the divorce papers. Ku Zhao did not care about his wife's divorce, but he could not ignore the creditors. The money on the IOU could be delayed, but if he did not hand over the house, the creditors would not do it. He did not know where that foreigner found a group of debt collectors, but each one was incomparably fierce. Ku Zhao had no choice but to borrow money from everywhere. However, those friends of his were now avoiding him. Just now, he went to borrow money from his good friend, Zhao Tsongjian's family. Zhao Tsongjian grunted for a long time and did not say a word. Instead, Zhao Tsongjian's wife insinuated that he was chased out. Now he was really at his wits' end. Ku Zhao was walking dejectedly when suddenly a person came toward him. Ku Zhao used to be a very arrogant person, but now he was poor and had no ambition, so he was too lazy to pay attention to him. He dodged to the side, but unexpectedly that person took a step forward and blocked in front of him. Ku Huangshi angrily raised his head and saw a big man in front of him. The man was a head taller than him, with his arms crossed and a sneer on his face. Ku Huangshi could not help but turn pale. He staggered 2 steps and said with a trembling voice, What are you doing?" Before his voice died away, he felt his shoulders tighten. He looked to his left and right and saw another 2 big men with unkind expressions. The one in front of him said, "Kujianshi, how many days has it been since you owe money? You should at least give an explanation to the creditors." Kujianshi smiled and said, "Aren't I trying to think of a way? Please give me a few more days." The other said, "Us brothers are only doing things for money. Whether we give you a few more days is not up to us. You should talk to the creditors. Take him away." Ku Zhao had no choice but to leave with them. In his opinion, if the other party wanted to collect the debt, they could not do anything to him. But once they left, Kujianshi would disappear. There were rumors in the streets that Kujianshi owed too many debts and was abandoned by his family, so he fled to a foreign land. Even the officials of Pang Prefecture, such as Pangling, Pangcheng, and Pangshi, thought the same. Therefore, the disappearance of a small, unranked official, Kujianshi, did not even raise a bubble in the Feng Prefecture. Chapter 898. On the Sherwang River, a small boat was slowly moving forward. 2 rows of undulating mountain ranges. The 2 banks of the river were covered in layers of peaks. It was a beautiful sight to behold. A scribe in a green robe stood at the bow of the boat. His hair was tied up in a bun and tied with a cloth ribbon. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze on the water and then fell back down again. The boatman walked over barefoot on the deck. He crossed his arms and bowed to the handsome scribes. "Lang Jun, the end of the water is the mouth of the kettle." The river water suddenly converged and poured down like the roar of 10,000 drums. It was a spectacular sight. The water vapor soared into the sky and covered the sun. Rainbows could be seen. It was beautiful. "Lang Jun, do you want to go take a look?" "No need." The scribes in a green robe smiled. "No need. I am going to Danzhou. I have important matters to attend to and cannot be delayed." "Yes." The boatman saw that he had an extraordinary bearing and that his entourage followed the rules carefully. He knew that his employer was not an ordinary person, so he was respectful and did not dare to act rashly. The scribes in a green robe looked forward again with a quiet smile. This scribes in a green robe was the current imperial censor Shiryu. When the imperial censor Shiryu received the court's order, he immediately rushed to Danzhou. During the Tang dynasty, Danzhou was later known as Ichuan. Although the imperial censor Shiryu did not have Yang Fan's guidance, like Hu Yuanli, he was not careless in the slightest. He started out as a nobody and later became a scholar. He was also favored by the Minister of Appointments at the time and was recruited as a son-in-law. Step by step, he entered the center of the court and became a noble imperial censor. He was very familiar with the affairs of the lower ranks. He did not think that the court had ordered him to review the case this time because there was a problem with the statistics. He knew about the existence of the hamsters and even knew some of their tricks. He had once impeached a provincial government official because he had tampered with the grain and ended up in prison. That time, the officials embezzled grain money. Not only did they inflate the price of grain higher than the market value, but they also added bran to the grain harvested from the barnyard, mixed it with warm water, and pretended to be the best rice. They were simply devoid of conscience. Most of these cases couldn't be completed by 1 or 2 people. Usually, the relevant officials, brokers, and grain merchants colluded to cheat. But that time he investigated openly and secretly and finally found solid evidence, bringing the group of corrupt officials to justice. With the experience from last time, he believed that if there was a problem in the Danjo government, he would be able to find solid evidence. The position of the right deputy imperial censor has been vacant for a long time. If I can solve this big case, the position of the right deputy imperial censor will definitely be mine. The censor shook his small fan, but his heart was even more excited. Shirwang River. Shirwang River. This river's name is so auspicious. If I can be promoted to imperial censor, sister-in-law will be happy for me. Thinking of this, Censor Shir was inexplicably excited, and his eyes became slightly moist. At that time, the censor was born in a poor family. His elder brother had passed away when he was young. At that time, the family was in dire straits. According to his father's wishes, he was supposed to drop out of school and become a farmer. It was his sister-in-law who fully supported him. She paid for his tuition, bought him school supplies, and encouraged him to continue his studies. Ever since he was a child, he had grown up step by step under the care of his sister-in-law. In his heart, his sister-in-law's kindness was heavier than a mountain, but he had nothing to repay his sister-in-law. He could only work hard in his career and use his achievements to bring honor to his ancestors, so that his sister-in-law, who had endured hardships to help him become successful, would be happy. Crack! Suddenly, a boat floated down from upstream at high speed. Although the river could not be considered narrow, it had not been raining recently, so the space suitable for boats was not very wide. The boat was a little too close. The 2 boats collided slightly, and the boat shook. The imperial censor lost his balance. He staggered a few steps and almost fell down. I'm really sorry. Someone on the opposite boat lightly called out. Slightly annoyed, the imperial censor looked up and saw the green bamboo curtain was rolled up high. In the opposite cabin sat a young married woman in a light green robe. Her robe was long and winding, and her collar revealed a lush green cheekbone, slowly covering a trace of snow white. Her black hair was lightly tied up, and only a sandalwood hairpin was inserted. Her temperament was like an orchid. Actually, if one were to talk about appearance, this young married woman could not be considered very beautiful. However, she was 60 to 70% good-looking. She was dressed appropriately, had an elegant temperament, and held a book in her hand. That kind of scholarly and elegant temperament was far more attractive to the heart of a scholar like the imperial censor Shir than a greasy nose and enchanting beauty. The young married woman covered her mouth with the book, but she only covered half of it. Her mouth was slightly open, revealing half of her white teeth. She looked apologetically at the imperial censor, but before she could say another word, the boat floated down. When the imperial censor saw this elegant young married woman, his annoyance was immediately swept away. He straightened his body and shook his clothes. Looking at the light boat that was quickly pulling away from his boat, he smiled slightly. Although the scenery on both sides of the river was beautiful, it was not as pleasing to the eyes as such a beautiful woman. This chance encounter caused ripples to ripple in his heart. It was a pleasant surprise in the midst of all the hardships along the way. The imperial censor Shir was determined not to have any dealings with the local officials on this trip to Danjo. He wanted to make a private visit incognito and secretly make some inquiries. This was to prevent the officials of Danzhou from hiding each other. Therefore, with the identity of a traveling scholar, when he arrived in Danzhou, he first ordered someone to rent a quiet and secluded building. Having just moved in, his body was tired. The imperial censor, sure, did not intend to go to the common people to make inquiries today. He first took a bath, changed his clothes, and rested. Just as he finished bathing and changed into light clothes, he heard the sound of a zither. The sound of the zither was at times as slow as a flowing spring, at times as fast as a waterfall, at times as clear as a pearl falling on a jade plate, and at times as low as a murmur. The winding sound flowed, slowly, straight to the heart. The imperial censor sure felt as if he was bathing in the spring breeze. The imperial censor sure knew that this row of houses was built by the local rich merchants. They were specially rented to guests traveling from south to north. There was only a short fence between them and the tenants of other people's houses. But he was also a person who loved the zither. Hearing such high-level zither skills, he couldn't help but feel excited. They were all travelers. What harm was there in seeing them? The imperial censor, sure, had the spirit of a scholar. Having made up his mind, he took out a small fan and followed the sound of the zither. The sound of the zither came from the forest behind the house. The imperial censor plucked the flowers and grass as he walked. The melodious sound of the zither gradually became clearer, and a slender figure appeared in the emerald green forest. The person's eyes were lowered as she played the zither. The corners of her lips slightly curled up. Black jade-like hair draped over her shoulders, and her cheeks were pink. It was obvious that she had just taken a bath. The lines of her beautiful neck and clearly visible collarbone were faintly discernible. She was elegant and otherworldly, like a solitary flower in the forest admiring itself. It was the young woman he had met by chance on the Sherwang River. It turned out to be a woman. If Shiryu took the liberty to approach her, it would be impolite. But if he retreated, it would be suspected of peeping. A gentleman is magnanimous, upright, and upright. Why should he be so scrupulous? As Shiryu was thinking, the young woman with the scent of books had already raised her head. Seeing him, she was surprised and stopped playing the zither. She stood up gracefully and smiled. So it's Lang Jun on the boat. It is fate that brought us together. Greetings. In Chang, and in the middle of a rustling bamboo forest, Shen Mu stood with his hands behind his back. Listening to the sound of the zither, he said, "Will this plan work?" Lan Jinhai, who was standing to the side, said confidently, "I am 80% sure." At that time, the imperial censor had been raised by his sister-in-law. His sister-in-law was born in a scholarly family and was virtuous and virtuous. The imperial censor's achievements today were all thanks to his sister-in-law. At this time, after the imperial censor passed the imperial examinations and became an official, he treated his sister-in-law with utmost sincerity and filial piety. At that time, the imperial censor was upright, honest, and self-disciplined. It was said that the reason why he agreed to be the son-in-law of the Minister of Personnel was not because he wanted to curry favor with the rich and powerful. It was because the minister's young daughter looked very similar to his sister-in-law. Furthermore, our men also found out that the imperial censor had been in brothels with his colleagues and friends. Other people only asked for young, beautiful, and coquettish girls to serve them. The imperial censor's choice was definitely a woman from a good family, and most of them were older than him. From this, I can deduce that the imperial censor must have fallen in love with his sister-in-law from respect. However, he would definitely not dare to reveal any of these thoughts to a person who revered him like a god. All of these were actually the feelings he had entrusted to him. The girl that I chose, her expression, temperament, and ability are all to his liking. Moreover, she has many tricks up her sleeves. I am not afraid that he will not fall for her. Shenmu sighed and said with a smile, "In that case, I have harmed a good official and hurt an infatuated person." Lan Jinhai laughed along with him and said, "What about Feng Zhou?" The newly appointed provincial governor of Feng Zhou is the current Juanma Pei-sen. He is not one of us. If Imperial Censor who arrives and cooperates with him, it will be difficult for Feng Zhou. Shinmu frowned and said, "The problem for Feng Zhou is that no matter how capable we are, it is impossible for us to produce so much food out of thin air." Feng Zhou. Just as he said this, there was a rustling sound in the bamboo forest. A strong man in a gray robe suddenly appeared in front of him. Slightly out of breath, he said, "Young master, it has just been delivered from Luoyang." Shinmu took a small bamboo tube and unplugged it. He took out a roll of paper from inside and unfolded it for a moment. Suddenly, he clenched the letter tightly in his hand. Lan Jinhai asked anxiously, "Young master, what is it?" Shinmu took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Xiao Yu acted on his own and angered Yangfan. I am afraid that the conflict between the obvious and hidden sects will become more and more difficult to resolve." North of Luoyang City, 1,000 cavalry barracks. Yangfan looked at the soldiers who were training seriously on the drill ground and listened to the heaven-shaking battle cries. He said to Rinwei, "Imperial Censorship is intelligent, capable, and has good conduct. He might be able to achieve something in Danzhou, but my focus has always been on Fengzhou. We cannot place all our hopes on Imperial Censorship. We cannot underestimate the hidden sect's capability, and we cannot underestimate Shinmu even more. As long as we give him enough time, he will definitely have a way to prevent us from finding any flaws. In my opinion, if we want to deal with a person like Shinmu, he will definitely seize the initiative. The Heaven Observation Division's method is too stable, and it isn't feasible." Rin Wei said, "Then sect patriarch means," Yangfan said, "we have to be quick. We are not prepared, and Shinmu is definitely not prepared either. However, we are the investigating party, and they are the ones being investigated. This is our advantage. Send an order to Lady Gu. When Imperial Censor who arrives, immediately contact Provincial Governor Pei. Only by messing around can we kill Shinmu, this old master." Chapter 899. It was early autumn and Luoyang was still hot and stuffy, but Danzhou was already in the midst of autumn. Almost half of Dan Province's territory was made up of mountains. Everywhere, the shade was like a canopy. Even during the hottest days of summer, it was not unbearably hot, much less early autumn. Therefore, even when the Imperial Censor closed the windows, the room did not feel stuffy. The room was not stuffy, but Imperial Censor's cheeks were flushed as if he was drunk, and his forehead was slick with sweat. Lying beneath him was the young woman he had met by chance on the river. This young woman's surname was Xia, and her maiden name was Rudian. She was a merchant's wife, and her husband was doing business in the north. Now that the north was not doing well, she had to return to her hometown. Her husband stayed behind to take care of the aftermath, so she was the first to wait for her husband's arrival. After becoming familiar with Imperial Censorship, they began to chat, such as how her family was infertile, how her husband doted on several concubines, and how he treated her coldly. Imperial Censorship sympathized with her. Xia Rudian also repeatedly displayed her talents in the four arts, all of which tickled Imperial Censorship's itch. Imperial Censorship liked her dignified appearance and elegant temperament. He also pitied her for her outstanding talent and knowledge. But she was a beautiful woman with a short life. Under her tenderness, in just a few days, the two of them became lovers and secretly communicated with each other. All that was left was the last layer of window paper that had not been poked through. These days, Imperial Censorship did not neglect his official duties. He sent his family members to the surrounding villages to do temporary work, harvest the early ripening crops, and take the opportunity to chat with the villagers. Imperial Censorship knew that many things could not be hidden from the higher-ups. If the higher-ups wanted to investigate, they might not be able to find out anything, but the people below them already knew. However, if you really wanted to investigate, those people would definitely not tell you, even if they were the ones who had suffered from it. You would have to leave, but they would have to live here for generations. Those heartless families were not rebelling, and you could punish one but not the whole family. They would rather suffer some hardship than offend the powerful people in the villages. Through this method, he was able to find out the truth. He also transformed himself into a grain merchant and visited several grain stores in the city. Gradually, he gained their trust and more or less understood the situation. Yesterday, the imperial censor had obtained a piece of conclusive evidence. In his great joy, he drank 2 more cups of wine and was momentarily unable to control himself. This young woman also had the intention to flatter him, so the 2 of them rolled around in a ball, like a pair of dewy mandarin ducks. Once this layer of window paper was pierced through, the dry firewood and raging fire would be unstoppable. At this time, imperial censorship saw that the little matron under him was charming and dignified, reserved and shy, giving off an indescribable feeling of beauty. He couldn't help but be aroused and bent down to hold her hot little face, sucking on her cherry lips and giving it a solid kiss. Unknowingly, the imperial censor kicked off his underpants and tore off her undergarments, wanting to be the guest behind the curtain. Xia Rudian's soft, jade-like arm supported his chest and said, "The sky is not completely dark, yet it's so embarrassing. What should I do?" The imperial censor panted and said, "Little miss is so beautiful. I really can't wait any longer. Now the arrow is already on the bowstring. I have no choice but to release it. Miss, please look." As he said this, he straightened his lower body and pushed hard against the little matron's soft belly. The matron let out a cry and shyly covered her face, not saying anything more. The imperial censor was delighted and put the shining white thighs on his shoulder. Looking at the thin red seam, he shook his head and sighed. The fragrant grass is desolate, but it's also enchanting. It cuts one's bones, eats one's soul. He exerted all his strength to push forward, and with 2 grunts, the clouds parted and the rain raged. While they were in the heat of the moment, they heard a loud noise from the other side of the door, as the door was forcibly smashed open. Many people wearing black clothes and little hats rushed in with lanterns and torches in their hands. They heard one of them shouted, "What a lowly servant! No wonder I couldn't find you in your room. Turns out you're having an illicit affair with someone." As soon as that person shouted, the imperial censor was so scared that his legs went limp. He hurriedly got down from the woman's body and saw 2 family members rushing in with lanterns. The one in the middle had 3 locks of long beard. His appearance was dignified. He was wearing a round neck robe with big sleeves and a soft horn cap on his head. He had an imposing manner and was really out of the ordinary. The imperial censor thought that the woman's husband, who was doing business in the north, had come today. He was so embarrassed that his face turned red to his ears. He was too ashamed to show his face and could only grab a thin veil to cover his face. The woman rolled down the bed naked and knelt in front of the man, dressed as a scholar. With tears in her eyes, she begged, "Ah Lang, please forgive me. It's not that I don't follow the ways of a woman, but he forced me to do it. I had no choice but to obey him." When the imperial censor heard this, he was startled, and a thought flashed through his mind, "Immortal leap!" The imperial censor was furious and said, "Good, good. Turns out you and your wife are experts in the art of a mortal leap. You want to extort money from me? Do you know my identity? Do you believe that I won't punish you for extortion and framing an official and exile you to 3,000 miles away?" The scholar with 3 locks of long beard was shocked and said, "You are an official? What kind of official are you? Since you've come to our prefecture, why don't you stay in a hotel but rent a room here? I'm the dignified governor of a prefecture. Why would I do something like extortion and framing an official?" The imperial censor was shocked and said in a daze, "Governor of a prefecture? You are." The scholar with 3 locks of long beard said, "I am the provincial governor of Danzhou, Li Junfeng." The imperial censor turned pale with fright and pointed at the woman who was kneeling naked on the floor, and said her surname was Xia and her name was Fengdian. Then who is she?" The scholar with 3 locks of long beard said, "That's my concubine. Because of my old wife's jealousy, she lives outside the prefecture." "Why?" The imperial censor looked at provincial Governor Li, and then at the woman with the surname Xie. The thin veil in his hand quietly slid down on the same night at the Peng Prefecture. It was the same clear wind and clear moon, poetic and picturesque. However, a few figures quietly snuck into the Peng Prefecture's granary, as if they were doing some shady business. The ones who snuck into the Peng Prefecture's granary were Miss Gu Zhuting and her 3 elder brothers. They had already found out the situation of the Peng Prefecture's granary from Ke. Currently, Ke was under their protection and served as an important witness. After walking around the Peng Prefecture for the past few days and verifying what Yang Fan had said before, Gu Zhuting finally understood why Yang Fan said grain was so important to a country. She also understood how these aristocratic families controlled or influenced the country's policies through grain. They used their great wealth to buy grain during a good harvest year and sold it during a bad harvest year. This was only the simplest method to make a huge profit. Buying grain from an area with an abundance of grain and transporting it to an affected area where there was a food shortage to sell, it could very well influence the anxious local authorities to make all kinds of decisions that were beneficial to them. Transporting grain was easy to say, but other than the authorities, only they had the manpower and resources to do it. Even if the authorities did not shirk responsibility or engage in corruption, their procedures were not as simple as the aristocratic families, and their efficiency was not as fast. Therefore, the only people the local authorities could rely on were the aristocratic families, and they would always be the only ones. This put them in an invincible position. As long as they did not want to rebel, the authorities could not take it by force. Everything had to be settled within the rules permitted by the country's laws. In this way, how could the local authorities not compromise? The commoners who had no food to eat would rise up in revolt, and the consequences were more serious than anything else. Therefore, the aristocratic families who controlled the grain, to a certain extent, had the right to speak. Furthermore, some areas mainly opened mines and set up factories. Some mainly cultivated mulberry and silkworms, some mainly cultivated rapeseed, and some mainly cultivated fruits and vegetables, cane sugar, winemaking, porcelain making, or fish and animal husbandry. These places had a large population, but their agriculture was not developed, and they relied heavily on imports of grain from other places. Therefore, the aristocratic families who controlled the purchase, transportation, and sale of grain from upstream could control the price of grain. Every increase or decrease in the price of grain would directly affect the local standard of living and indirectly affect the prices of the local industries. Those who produced minerals would have to raise the price of minerals. Those who produced oil would have to raise the price of edible oil. And those who produced fruits and vegetables, cane sugar, winemaking, porcelain making, or fish and animal husbandry would have to raise their prices accordingly. And if the price of clothing, accommodation, food, and trade all rose in price, then the price of the farmers selling grain and the laborers transporting grain would naturally rise as well. Therefore, the price of grain itself would rise again. The price of grain would rise again, stimulating the prices of other industries to continue to rise. This vicious cycle would eventually get out of hand. All of these changes were related to the national economy and the people's livelihood, and related to the stability of the world. How could the rulers turn a deaf ear to them? The rulers who turned a deaf ear to these problems, or the rulers who could not solve these problems, would eventually become an important cause of all kinds of social conflicts and even lead to destruction. In any aspect, if the decisions of the imperial court seriously affected the interests of the aristocratic families who controlled the economic lifeline of the country, and the agents they supported in the government could not stop the implementation of these decrees, they could use these economic means. There was no obvious operator behind all of this, and its effect was real. This was what Li Taigong said. The elephant is invisible and the great sound is silent. It's there, but no one feels it. It's working, but no one thinks it's the result. And this was only one of the means the aristocratic families used to influence the imperial court. They supported the agents in politics, controlled the public opinion in culture, and controlled all kinds of industries closely related to the country's economy. Any one of these could have an impact on the imperial court. Since ancient times, it was unknown how many talented and bold reformers were ultimately defeated, and their reputations were tarnished. It was all because of this kind of power. Of course, a powerful government could also use its political power to regulate when this kind of power came into play. But in the end, no matter who won or lost, the winner would also suffer a great loss. This was a double-edged sword. Therefore, in the face of all kinds of conflicts, the whole society would mostly move forward through compromise, and rarely would it develop to the point of life and death. Even so, one could see how powerful this kind of power was. Lang has this kind of power. Thinking of this, Gu Zhuting's heart surged. Of course, she didn't understand that this kind of power would never be determined by one or two people. In the past, for example, when the reform of Emperor Yang of Sui affected the interests of the entire aristocratic families, there was no organization like the Hall of Succession at that time. It was the same choice of interests that made those aristocratic families choose the same means. In the end, this became an important factor in the destruction of the Great Sui. In this world, the existence of the Hall of Succession made the first-class aristocratic families have a closer relationship. They could communicate and discuss many things, and this kind of power was stronger than before. But to make them reach an agreement, it was not something that could be decided by one or two people. But there was no doubt that Yang Fan would be the one to unleash this demonic power if there was a need to do so at this moment. This was enough to make Gu Zhuting have the impulse to worship him. That was such a powerful force, and she was beside the man who controlled this power. Unfortunately, that man is stingy to give me a little love. Leaping over the high wall like a leopard cat, Gu Zhuting lightly landed on the ground. Her heart was slightly sour. Gu didn't know what his little sister was thinking about. He vigilantly crouched on the ground, carefully observed for a moment, and pointed out, "The granary that Kazhao said might have a problem is over there." Gu Zhuting calmly glanced over and said, "Let's check the third granary from the left first." Since there could be a problem with all the granaries there, why should they start from the third granary from the left? The Gu brothers didn't ask. They knew that their little sister was vigilant, and they couldn't compare to her in terms of intelligence. Since she said so, there must be a reason. So they gestured to each other, and the few of them turned into a few wisps of smoke and slowly swept towards the granary. Chapter 900. There were a total of 247 granaries and 26 grain kilns in Pingzhou. Millet could be stored for 9 years and rice for 5 years. It was a large granary in Guanyi Road. The kilns were cylinder-shaped with a large mouth and a small bottom. They were 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. The granaries were cone-shaped with rammed earth as the walls. There was a ventilation tower on the roof and a herringbone roof with gray tiles on top. The interior had 4 beams and 8 pillars and was very sturdy. There were no nails or rivets at the joints of the beams and the pillars. The wood was connected by yin and yang tenons. Before the founding of the Tang dynasty, this was an important granary for the Great Sui. A major corruption case had occurred here. Emperor Yang of Sui sent people to investigate, and the imperial envoy was very capable. He quickly solved the case. However, this imperial envoy was chasing thieves and arresting corrupt officials at the same time. He also embezzled a large portion of the stolen goods. At that time, the Great Sui was already in a precarious situation. There were many internal factions fighting each other. The matter was quickly grasped by a rival faction and was reported to the emperor. Emperor Yang of Sui was furious and sent people to investigate him from among the officials of that faction. In the end, when the next imperial envoy was chasing the previous imperial envoy's stolen money, he also embezzled a large amount of gold and silver from the previous imperial envoy. Not only that, he also took one of the previous imperial envoy's beautiful concubines as his own. Thus, there were people who were watching him and reported him again. In the end, the heads of the imperial envoy and his entourage hung on the walls of Pingzhou were no less than the number of corrupt local officials Corruption is your corruption. Corruption is your corruption. When a country was about to fall, there would be evildoers. Some people thought about rebelling, and some people madly amassed wealth. Since then, there had not been such a major corruption case in Pengzhou's granaries. But now, Gu Zhuting and her 3 brothers were playing the role of anti-corruption, righteous people. The hooks were thrown to the top of the granary and hooked onto the roof. The 4 siblings quickly climbed up like agile apes. Grain piled together would produce heat, and in serious cases, it could even spontaneously combust. Although the ancients did not know the principle, they knew this phenomenon. Thus, the ventilation tower built on top of the granary was connected to the granary below. The 4 of them went up to the roof and saw that it was dark below. They did not dare to jump down rashly. Gu Zhuting used the rope to go down first. After walking for less than 10 feet, her feet touched the grain pile. She felt relieved and said, "Come down, it's only 10 feet high." When the 3 brothers heard the sound, they judged the height and position of the tree and jumped down one by one. One of them took out a match and lit it. Then from his bosom he took out a large butter candle and lit it. The other opened a folded white silk lampshade and placed the candle under it. The bright and soft light immediately shone out. The light did not reach more than 10 feet, and they could not see the granary walls. It was still dark. The 4 people felt as if they were in the stomach of a Gu Zhuting looked around and frowned. The granary is full. It looks like there are no problems. Gu of her. Gu of gu of gu of people of the granaries of the granary of the granaries of. The eldest brother of the Gu family muttered, "Dianshi Ku is only a lowly official. He doesn't know how these corrupt officials embezzled and misappropriated the provisions. He just followed along and opened the door for convenience, taking a small advantage. However, he insisted that the granaries here did not have enough grain, and there was evidence. He knows how much grain should be stored in each of these granaries. But the fact that less than half of the grain that should be stored in the granaries has already filled up the granaries is a strange thing in itself." The second son of the Gu clan said, "Perhaps this granary is fine? Should we check the other warehouses?" Gu Zhuting thought for a moment and said, "You guys wait here, I'll go take a look." She pulled the rope and nimbly climbed up, disappearing in a flash. After the time it took for 2 incense sticks to burn, the rope swayed, and Gu Zhuting returned to the warehouse. The Gu brothers were sitting on a pile of grain, and as soon as they saw her, they immediately stood up. Without waiting for her brothers to ask, Gu Zhuting shook her head and said, "All of them are the same, full of rations." The eldest brother of the Gu family said doubtfully, "Could it be that Dianshi Ku is lying?" Gu Zhuting said, "He doesn't look like a loyal and righteous person to me." The third son of the Gu clan thought for a moment and said, "Every year, the Ministry of Revenue and the Imperial Censorate check the grain. If they could see the shortage at a glance, they wouldn't have been safe for so many years. There must be something strange about this. We should check this granary." Old Gu stared at him and said, "How?" Old Gu pointed to the wooden shovels stuck in the grain pile and said, "Dig them down." Old Gu cried out, "There's so much grain, dig them down? You're really stupid." Before he could finish, Gu Zhuting's eyes suddenly lit up, and she said happily, "This is a good idea. Sometimes using smart people's methods to deal with smart people is not the right way. Stupid people's stupid methods are more effective against smart people." This was what Yang Fan had said. Gu Zhuting had an inexplicable faith in Yang Fan. Now that she repeated Ah Lang's words, her heart was filled with sweetness, and she smiled like a blooming flower. Old Gu Sen touched his nose and said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, "Youngest sister, I don't even know if you're praising me or insulting me." Gu Zhuting made a face at him, for wooden shovels flew up and down. Fortunately, the granary was spacious, otherwise the grains would be loose and the grain piled up on the walls would collapse at any time, and they wouldn't be able to keep digging in the middle. However, The granary was very spacious, and the four of them were skilled in martial arts, so their digging speed was very fast. The four of them dug to a depth of nearly 10 feet. Old Gusan was secretly disappointed and was about to tell the siblings to stop when Gu Zhuting's shovel hit something hard. The four of them stopped at the same time, looked at each other, and immediately sped up. After a while, as they cleaned up, the wooden floor gradually appeared under their feet. Gu Zhuting used her hand to knock on the floor, and there was a clank sound. Gu Zhuting said in a deep voice, "This is empty." Old Gusan said, "These corrupt officials really use all kinds of strange methods. Even this kind of method exists." Gu Zhuting said, "To do something like this in the granary, it means that they have been embezzling the grain for a long time, and there can't be just 1 or 2 people involved. Otherwise, how could they build such a big thing in the granary without anyone knowing? I'm afraid they did it from top to bottom. Even the state officials and the granary officials are involved." Old Gu San thought for a moment and said, "The granary can be tampered with, the accounts can also be tampered with, but when the Ministry of Revenue and the censorate inspected the grain, how could they be so perfunctory? Could it be that they bribed all the officials? The Ministry of Revenue inspection that Ah Lang gave us requires us to open the granary. There is no grain down there. How can they fool people?" Gu Zhuting's eyes flashed. She suddenly picked up the wooden shovel and dug along the wooden floor. Very soon, she reached the edge, about 10 feet away from the granary wall. From the edge, she could see that the wooden floor below was probably a round barrel. Gu Zhuting was enlightened. "I understand now. This is a granary within a round granary filled with round columns, with grain around it and grain on top. The regulations that Ah Lang gave us said that when the Ministry of Revenue inspected the grain, they would insert a 1.5 foot wooden tube into the grain pile to check if the grain inside was damaged, moldy, or shoddy. This wooden tube is at least 7 to 8 feet away from the granary wall. There is no problem at all." The four of them looked at each other and smiled. Old Gu said, "They must have used more than one method. Do we still need to inspect the other granaries?" Gu Zhuting stood up gracefully, gently wiping the sweat from her forehead. She smiled lightly. "There's no need. It would be bad if people found out. This is enough evidence. Put the grain back. When censor who arrives, we will expose their conspiracy to the world." Danzhou Hoku Waterfall. The deafening roar lasted for tens of thousands of years. Imperial censor Shi looked at the softest water in the world fiercely smashing down the cliff. Roaring, roaring, surging, splashing water mist that covered the sky and covered the earth. The rapids swirled rapidly, giving him the urge to dive in head first and be crushed into pieces by the torrent. Provincial Governor Li stood at the side. Stroking his beard, he leisurely said, "Such a magnificent sight, Censor Shi. Do you have the mood to compose a poem?" Imperial Censor Shi's face was ashen. He turned around without saying a word. Provincial Governor Li smiled happily and said, "Miss Jian is proficient in zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. There is nothing she isn't proficient in. Her romance on the bed is even more memorable. If the Imperial Censor likes it, I will give her to you. What do you think?" Shi was so angry that his whole body was trembling. He suddenly turned around and glared at Li Junfeng. "Envoy Li, don't go too far!" Provincial Governor Li also didn't want to ridicule him too much. It would be bad if he really provoked this person to the point that he didn't care about the consequences, so he only laughed. After that scandal, Imperial Censor Shi could no longer put on the image of an upright and unyielding Imperial Censor in front of Provincial Governor Li. He didn't dare to ask about the suspicious point of the grain storage in Danzhou anymore. Right now, he could only wait for time, waiting to report to the Imperial Court that there was no evidence. Every time he thought about how he couldn't control himself and fell into someone else's trap, Imperial Censor Shi felt like a knife was twisting in his heart. But he was afraid that if the scandal spread, his clean reputation would be destroyed, afraid that he would be removed from his post, making his sister-in-law, who had always been proud of him, sad and disappointed. Hearing the dragon-like roar of the waterfall, Imperial Censor sure really wanted to shout, but the only thing he could do was to raise his head, tears falling like rain. It was raining heavily in Luoyang. Since the Tang dynasty, there were 3 capitals in the country. Shijingchang and was often dry, Beijing Taiyuan was near the border, and Dongjing Luoyang was prone to floods. Luo, Bai, Jiangu, and many other rivers all flowed through Luoyang. So when Luoyang and its surrounding areas received a lot of rain, Luoyang would have a flood. Luoyang would have a large-scale flood once every 10 years, and the specific time would be during the summer and autumn when the monsoon was affected. Ever since Yang Fan arrived at Luoyang, he hadn't encountered a continuous rainstorm. But this year, there was unusually much rain, something he had never encountered before. Most of the areas in Luoyang had already turned into a vast ocean. Although the water wasn't deep, it was extremely difficult to traverse, and it was inconvenient to enter and exit. Many shops in the market had closed, and the price of food and vegetables had started to gradually rise. The originally scheduled autumn examination had also been postponed indefinitely. Yang Fan was in the palace, so all the news from all over the world was sent here, so he was the most aware of the severity of the water situation. This year there was too much rain, so the embankments were being strengthened everywhere, and the water level had also increased. The river water surged, and day and night it was like the roar of a bull. The power of heaven and earth couldn't help but change the expression of people. A large boat had even been prepared by the moat to the north of the palace, in case something happened to the emperor, the crown prince, and the others to avoid the flood. However, if the embankments really collapsed, the boat would be completely useless. Yang Fan was worried about his family, so he stole some free time to come back and told his family to prepare enough food and temporarily go to the Dragon's Gate to avoid the flood. But coincidentally, he hadn't even said a few words when Chui Lin of Qinghe braved the heavy rain to stop him.